Good morning, and welcome to WITA's Trade and Technology Summit. We can ask folks to please be seated. We're delighted to welcome you all here today, whether you are joining us in person, online via Zoom, or on C-SPAN. WITA is the International Trade Membership Association with members across the United States and around the world joining us today from 16 different countries. Welcome. Big thanks to our sponsors who made today's event possible: Amazon, the Consumer Technology Association, Coupang, the Information Technology Industry Council, National Foreign Trade Council, Silverado Policy Accelerator, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the World Trade Center DC, and the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center are hosts in this wonderful venue. Thank you. And thanks to your support, we're able to host nearly 300 government officials from around the world, both in person and online, thanks to the support of our sponsors. So thanks again for that. We have a packed schedule today, so we won't have lengthy introductions of all our speakers. But you should have a QR code on your table or one that was sent around to folks watching online, so you can download the program and you can read the biographies of our speakers here. And if you're watching on Zoom, I can't promise which sessions, but we'll try to get to questions from our online guests as well. So thank you. Now, after we just had a lovely breakfast networking event, we try to host events both in person and online at WITA. And now we're ready to get started with our event today. We have a fireside chat to get things started. I want to welcome to the stage Ambassador Rick Switzer, the Deputy United States Trade Representative in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and our moderator, Gary Shapiro, the CEO and Vice Chair of the Consumer Technology Association, and the author of Pivot or Die, which is his new book that's available in the foyer for those of you who have joined us in person. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Rick, for joining us today.
Wow, thank you for that introduction. It's a little brief, but it's okay. Ambassador, we're so happy to have you here. Looking at the guest list of people that are attending this, you attract a lot of attention. You're very important, obviously, and it takes, given the audience here, I'd say that 95% of the people are here to hear you directly because you are helping lead one of the most fundamental changes in economic policy the United States has ever had. And it's something which is quite a big deal for a lot of companies, a lot of people, and certainly the American consumer based on polls, based on everything else. I have a series of questions I'd like to ask you, You've worked on China since the very beginning. We were talking about that before we went on. I've talked about for 15 years. In my first book, The Comeback, with a foreword by Mark Cuban, I start out talking about the danger that China threatens the United States and the world in terms of its focus on taking over a lot of manufacturing, and we had to elevate ourselves. And I gave a prescription for the government for that, which wasn't followed, unfortunately, but the thoughts are still valid. So the question is, there's a lot of things that China does, like forced technology transfer. They have a culture of copying without authorization. And they have market access restrictions, which are unfair, and they hurt American businesses. What are you doing about these in trade negotiations and enforcement of the Phase 1 deal?
Yeah, I think, fundamentally, I think that the question probably should be reframed in some ways, right? I don't think there's any fundamental way to open the Chinese market and to force them to play by sort of fair reciprocal rules. I think that was, there was a good faith effort made in the first Trump administration. Frankly, it was the first time the U.S. government ever sat down and really did try to hold China to account and try to come up with a set of principles and structures that were designed to essentially force reciprocity. For a generation, folks have thought about, access to the China market and how that would be beneficial to all. And you had WTO accession, and to be honest with you, more than a generation, quite literally in the 1800s, American, traders and European sort of trading houses had imagined the value of accessing the China market. It is something that has sort of captured the mind of sort of commercial interests in the West for many, many generations. The problem with that entire enterprise was that it often ignored the sort of the specific cultural sort of intuition of Chinese policymakers. And by that I mean they have always looked at foreign trade as a zero-sum enterprise. And that, despite the rhetoric, that is how they view it today as well. There really is a finite pie, and in their mind, anyone who gets a slice of pie in their market is de facto a loss for their producers. But they are very excited to get as much of the international pie as they can get. And this is played out through their 5-year plans. For instance, if you read through any of the 5-year plans going back to the 12th or 11th 5-year plan, long before Made in China 2025, China had identified segments of its economy where China would produce X percent of that market. So one of the oldest ones actually is from the second 5-year plan. It's affectionately known as the Great Leap Forward to most folks, but most folks don't realize the Great Leap Forward was literally just part of the second 5-year plan. That was just the name they gave it. It also happens to be the greatest man-made disaster in human history. Killed about 30 million people for an industrial policy. That industrial policy basically said China would be the largest producer of steel and iron and aluminum by X date. That was a zero-sum account. Right? It wasn't China would become exceptionally efficient and would build, factories that could compete with the world. It was, here is the pie, and we will have this percentage of the pie. And in order to meet our goal, that means someone else has to lose. Now, we see that in semiconductors today. We've already seen this happen in rare earths, in magnets, and we're now seeing it in NEVs. All these things have a very long history of defining a market, defining percentages of the market that China will take, and then using any tool at their disposal in order to meet their goal.
But here we are, though, in the Ronald Reagan building. President Reagan spoke out forcefully against tariffs. Virtually every Republican president until this one has. And in less than 1 year, the world has totally changed. So now that every country in the world is looking at the U.S. differently, it's not a bastion of free trade it was. It's not the shining light it was. And here we are, and we're dealing with this in this building. So how do you perceive that in terms of the world focused on tariffs? President Reagan warned it invites retaliation and trade wars. It obviously causes inflation and raises prices. Tariffs are taxes. The Supreme Court heard the arguments on that, and many of the justices seem rather persuaded of the fact that tariffs are taxes. How do we switch this boat called the United States, a big ship, around so quickly so the rest of the world views us differently? And how do you view your role in that?
So, not to be overly confrontational, but I reject pretty much every premise. Reagan was in a world where it was a U.S. bloc, the Soviet communist bloc, including China, were outside of the normal trading regime, and so they weren't really participating in it. In that world, being anti-tariff made sense. In the post-China entering WTO world, that didn't make sense any longer. So, and Reagan did a ton of stuff on industrial policy that were not tariff related, but he was very willing to use industrial policy tools to go after semiconductors, to go after Japanese autos. There were a series of non-tariff restrictions on Japanese auto trade in the United States that were forced on the Japanese, to be quite fair, by USTR, also to be fair. And so Reagan was very comfortable using the tools that worked at the time. Reagan today, I would argue, would understand that tariffs would have to be a part of the equation if he were coming into the presidency right now and looking at what happened after China entered in WTO. So I'd put that out there first. I reject the notion that tariffs are inflationary. They're not inflationary. As a matter of fact, the last time we raised tariffs actually led to a deflationary cycle in the United States. A one-time increase in imported goods is not inflationary by any definition. If you look at, for instance, where most average folks consume their goods, their housing, their energy, their health care, and their food, almost none of those are traded goods. So the basket of goods that comes into the average consumer that's actually a traded good is around 20%. If you had a one-time increase, and we've talked to a lot of folks and looked at our own models, talked to most of the biggest investment firms and banks, many of the very, very best from Wall Street have told us, you know, we expect to maybe see a 4 to 5% increase in prices over the next couple of quarters based upon the tariffs that have come in. If you take that 4 or 5% off of 20% of consumed goods, that's a very small one-time price increase. So, and the reduction in energy and the regulatory reductions will allow the economy to grow. So at a rate that is not inflationary. So we are dealing with a previous inflationary cycle that was driven by a previous government's overspending and overregulation and decrease in output and supply. So we have a supply constrained environment because we're not producing, which has driven inflation more than anything else. So that I also reject. I also reject the notion that tariffs are taxes. They're not taxes. Not even fundamentally close to taxes. First of all, taxes are not born essentially in a one-third ratio, right? If I tax you, you pay the tax. If the U.S. government puts a tariff on it, China reduces they lower the value of their currency on purpose in order to make it so that they can eat part of that. Their producers eat some of the costs. Some of the costs are passed along through the wholesalers internally through efficiency and other things, and literally maybe a third of the actual cost finally going to Americans who pay at one point, but you're protecting a whole other layer of American taxpayers. And one of the reasons why we run a massive or massive fiscal deficit is because we have destroyed millions of factory jobs that were middle-class jobs that paid taxes in the upper middle class. Every time you shut down a factory, you don't just take out the workers who work there. You take out the services, the investment tail, all the other folks who come and do the other work to keep that factory running. Most of those jobs pay far more than in the service industry itself. And so you destroyed in many communities entire tax bases. And when you destroy a tax base, you leave a situation where you have a very high-end tax base that is benefiting from globalization, who can protect their earnings from taxes, and you have a lower-end one who pay very little taxes. And so as you shrink that middle who actually pay their taxes and do not have the methods to pay a smaller percentage, and you have folks who at the bottom increasingly pay no taxes, what you've done is you've shrunk the tax base, which has led to increased deficits across the country. And one of the ways you can sort of reverse that is tariffs bring in revenue, but they also incentivize people to rebuild that industrial-based middle class. 1 million new industrial workers in the United States would lead to 3 or 4 million new high-paying jobs that would go along with it. Because every one of those factories is, as I said, is going to have a services tail, a finance tail. You have the advanced robotics. You have all the other pieces that go along with those workers who work in a factory who typically don't get counted. And so now you're talking 3 or 4 or 5 million new upper middle class jobs. That's a lot of new upper middle class jobs providing income tax and a tax base to communities across America, to be fair, who have been completely left out of the globalization drive.
Well, I'd love to have a debate on that. I'll just agree to disagree because I do the shopping, food shopping in my family, and I'll tell you prices are pretty high on a whole range of things. And I know you could come up with exceptions and stories and things like that, but the 50% tax on cabinets, for example, being sold in the U.S., if you're buying a home or creating a home now, those are real price increases that Americans feel. And most Americans would agree that the polls show that Americans find least support for tariffs of anything, and that's why we had our Boston Tea Party. But I want to ask something we may agree on, which is that the fact that the tech industry is one of the bright lights of the American economy, and we're doing well. Through innovation, I think we have led the world, and we can continue to do so with good strategies. But we're finding American companies are facing restrictions in other countries on data flows and digital services. What's the USTR doing about that with reciprocal trade agreements? When there's restrictions by other countries, is there anything focusing on data flows and digital services you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, that's a priority of the president. We had an executive order that really tasked USTR and other elements of the U.S. government to push back on sort of repressive regulatory structures that increase taxes or regulatory burden on U.S. digital services and trade. U.S. Digital services and trade and increasingly AI-enabled services and software are going to be powerful drivers of both economic efficiency and productivity and wealth generation. And the United States stands at the forefront of all of that, as you noted. And so it's critical for USTR, in particular, as sort of the tip of the spear on this, but the entire U.S. government, to push back across the board on these structures. Many of them come out of Europe, to be fair. Europe, I would argue, has decided that it was too hard to do the innovation work. It was too hard to sort of reorder their economy, to encourage entrepreneurship, to make it so that capital could reform in ways that you can in the United States, to support entrepreneurs in their drive to build new businesses, and that it was easier to try to regulate the U.S. And really throttle back U.S. leadership in such a way that they could maintain contact with us from a leadership perspective. What I mean is that the lead the U.S. is really taking on many of these technologies. Europe is actively trying to use a regulatory regime to slow the U.S. down so they can't get too far ahead of Europe. And we find this on AI, we find this on a number of other areas. And so fundamentally, we see this as regressive action that is targeted directly at the United States to make up for their own shortcomings. There are other elements of this around freedom of speech and some other elements that the administration, myself included, find to be very disturbing. But fundamentally, it's about using a regulatory state regime in order to sort of hem in your opponent. China uses a different methodology. Their methodology is to have a fortress China approach, which is you just don't let U.S. digital firms compete in the China market. You try to take as much technology as you can. You put a ton of government subsidies into it, and then you go out and fight for global access. The U.S., on the other hand, has actually let most Chinese companies in on the digital side while being walled out from China for over 20 years. TikTok, which we sort of finally resolved for national security reasons, is a very good example of that, right? So all TikTok's competitors from the U.S. were locked out of the China market for 20 years, but the United States let TikTok sort of grow inside the United States. On a pure trade reciprocity basis, I have argued for a long time that that was an unfair thing. We should have done a lot about that earlier. There are national security reasons why the Congress acted on TikTok. But again, the U.S. market remains mostly open with a few very narrow restrictions to everyone, including China. And then it's U.S. firms who are willing to compete in our own home market who are being increasingly restricted. So we have, we have different actions in the 232s that have been taken against Europe. Our trade agreement we're looking to do with Europe tries to deal with this directly. The president has engaged, the vice president has engaged, Ambassador Greer is engaged directly on this. In our agreements on reciprocal trade, we've sought to address this directly. We have, within our Malaysia agreement on reciprocal trade, we have agreements that they would remove sort of VAT tax on U.S. digital trade. We have agreements that we're building in where they support the permanent moratorium on trade restrictions on digital trade through MC14. So it's a priority for us. And it's something whenever I speak to any government, it's the first thing that I speak about, actually. It's actually my personal priority. I think that if U.S. firms and the U.S. economy is going to really continue to grow in the way it should and really drive prosperity and wealth, not just for the United States, but for the world in leveraging these new tools. Imagine if we let Europe restrict the spread of the internet and how much productivity and wealth creation and knowledge creation has been driven by the internet. If Europe had decided early on the internet, oh, the United States is running away with this thing, I think if they knew then where Google and these guys would end up, they would have done what they're trying to do now. Their playbook is sort of backwards looking. They have a rear view mirror trade policy a lot of times, and their rear view mirror says, oh, the United States beat us with Google and Facebook and Amazon, and we can't let that happen again. Right? And so their response is regulatory structures. Their response isn't, what about what the United States did to embrace technology allowed them to create these firms in the first place? And let's see how we can actually have regulatory reform and capital formation reform and labor reform in such a way that we could actually create competitive firms on our own. Instead, they think in a sort of a rear view mirror policy of how do we restrict the U.S.'s ability to do this to us again?
Thank you for that answer. I appreciate that. I want to go to the big picture because I don't want to run out of time without getting there. And so we represent 1,200 American technology companies, a nonprofit association. And for years we have fought for free trade. We pushed a lot of trade agreements. We appreciate what the USTR has done historically. And lately we said tariffs. We obviously talked about how we disagree on that. But we've almost switched in a way because we've got the syndrome, I would talk on behalf of many of my members, if not all, and the fact that the government has been so, it's not only the tariffs themselves, executive time has totally changed out of focusing on dealing with all the possible scenarios of rapidly changing tariffs. So I guess the question is, what's the long-term vision here? Where are we going? We know that as a country, we cannot possibly build in the next 10 or 15 or even 20 years the factories that China has, the technology. We don't have the skills, the labor, or the low-cost ability to do that, and we've pushed out a lot of our labor that could help in that. So where are we going? We've argued that we should be working with our allies to share the expertise that we have and have closer bonds with those allies. Many of whom are in this room through various embassies. And we don't feel we're going in that direction. We feel that the relationship with the allies is less close, especially on trade, than it was before. What is the end game here of all these tariffs? Putting aside China, which is its own special case, what do we want to do with the rest of the world? Do we want to have barriers everywhere? Where are we going?
Yeah, again, I sort of, not to be confrontational, I kind of reject the whole premise, right? We have been bringing down barriers to U.S. market access. If you look at the agreements on reciprocal trade, if you look at any of the joint statements we put out, the fundamental approach of USTR has been, yes, the tariffs are there for a very good reason in many cases, because we are facing a national security threat directly from these massive trade deficits, which are the result of a trade policy that essentially said the United States will open up to the rest of the world, and we'll let the rest of the world, in most cases, raise up all sorts of non-tariff barriers and other tariff barriers that they have in place, regulatory barriers, phytosanitary barriers, decisions to not let certain products of ours in, very narrow, very specific things around, we put very high taxes on cars by engine size, or we have, very strict phytosanitary regulations that make it so that your ag products can't get in. And so that's where the arts have focused, on trying to open those markets. On the other side, if you look at what we've done with Japan and Korea, we're encouraging our allies to come and invest, right? To say, hey, this market is massive, right? I think here's one of the sort of fundamental pieces, two pieces on this. First of all, the United States has a net negative investment position of $26 trillion. That is a function of trade deficits that have gone on for generations. $26 trillion in net negative investment position for the United States shouldn't happen. You look at how competitive this country is, you look at our technology dominance, you look at our financial services dominance. The only reason we have a net negative investment position of $26 trillion is because we have let this trading system fester for such a long time, where we ran a $1.2 trillion trade deficit last year, under the last year of the Biden administration. That is fundamentally destabilizing. At some point, if you have a large enough net negative investment position, even a country like the United States could face some sort of a black swan event where currency devaluation or other things come along. So the president rightly said, hey, that's dangerous. We cannot let that continue forever. And the sooner we look to address this problem, because when you get to a net negative $50 trillion investment position, now you're talking about, a larger than the GDP perhaps of the United States. That becomes really, really problematic. The sooner you deal with that problem, the more likely you are to handle it in a way that is somewhat disruptive, but not really destructive, right? And we're looking to provide a little bit of disruption to prevent future destruction of whole markets. So that's one piece.
Could you just paint a picture, 5 to 10 years from now? What does the world look like? The U.S. look like? Is it going to have massive factories everywhere producing pencils and things like that? What do you want to see?
So we want to see a renaissance of industrialization in the United States, of manufacturing. We traded away and we used, I think, a faulty model of globalization that said that shareholder value maximization at any cost without anyone looking at the national security and economic security implications of that is a net benefit for the United States. I reject that premise, right? All of our major trading competitors have industrial policies that say, no, some of these industries are critical. We have to have them there. You can't end up in a world where you have world-class universities and, trillionaire investment folks and a handful of trillionaire, technology people and no middle class and a whole huge dependency where we're essentially, this weird, barbell-shaped economy where we export commodities like oil and gas and soybeans, and we have this very powerful finance technology arm and nothing in between. That's a hollow economy. It's very dangerous. And so we need to bring that back. But that isn't saying it's not a Fortress America approach. Again, if you look at the agreements of reciprocal trade and you look at where the tariffs have landed, they're essentially at what I would call a neutral rate. Right, a neutral rate meaning that if efficiency is applied properly, you could invest in one, say Malaysia, and sell in the United States, or you could invest in the United States with the same factory and sell to the United States, and they'd be roughly in balance. And that's what we're trying to get, is essentially a neutral rate. And there's a reason why the U.S. is unique among global economies, where we actually do need some level of tariff on pretty much everyone. And in order to achieve that neutral rate is because the United States is a $20 trillion consumer economy. That's more than China, who has tons of non-tariff barriers, Europe combined, actually, and you'd probably have to add in half of Japan in order to get to what the U.S. consumer market is. What that means is that every single company in the world that's not in the United States says, what's my number one market? For every country, I don't care where you're from, I don't care if you're Singapore or Bangladesh or China, your number one market is the United States. For an American firm, what's your number one market? The United States. So everyone's number one market is the United States. Well, you can't operate in a world where the United States is the most important target of every firm on the planet and expect U.S. firms to compete equally with Malaysia, right? Because there's only so much strategy, so much capital, so much sort of brain power of the C-suite to put on it. So if they're putting most of their focus on the U.S. market and then they think, aha, maybe it's Mexico next, by the time they get to Malaysia, you've got, the third-year associate who's in charge of running it. So what I'm trying to point out is that there's an inherent disparity in the sort of terms of trade, ante, right? Ex-ante for the United States. And this is why we've tried to come at this position where what's the neutral rate? Where does it become pretty much in balance in that it's economically as viable to make the investment in the United States as elsewhere? USMCA, we're going through review, is a huge part of how a U.S. North America-based industrial base would come in. I would say for most of our critical things like semiconductors, steel, a lot of other heavy production things, the United States should domestically produce roughly what we consume, roughly. But that doesn't mean everything we produce gets consumed here. What it means is that we produce it efficiently and we trade it and other folks trade in. But on semiconductors, the United States is sort of, the end sort of consumption place of about 30% of the world's semiconductors. Not if you look at trade flows, but when you look at the final resting place, when the server gets installed, when the car that has them in it when it gets sold, when the laptop or the smartphone gets sold, the United States ends up being almost 30% of all semiconductors consumed, right? But the United States actually only produces about 8% of the world's semiconductors. And even that's really just the actual fabbing of the silicon. It's not the actual finished semiconductor.
Ambassador, I appreciate your courage in coming to this audience, which is probably more free trade oriented than you are. But we recognize that national security is extremely important, and but putting everything under that rubric is a bit of a challenge. Thank you for your time. Thanks to the association for having us both.
Thank you. Oh, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ambassador Switzer. Thank you, Gary Shapiro. Really appreciate you both making the time to join us here today. We're going to keep things moving right along. I'd like to now invite to the stage Brandon Remington. Brandon is the Deputy Undersecretary for Policy at the International Trade Administration. He's one of the leaders at the Department of Commerce advising the International Trade Administration on global competitiveness, technology, and AI. After his remarks, he'll be joined on the stage by Arrow Auduro, Head of International Policy for the Americas at Amazon. Thank you all, and Brandon.
Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this morning. I'd like to thank the Washington International Trade Association for the invitation to speak at your inaugural Tech and Trade Summit. I have the privilege of serving as the Deputy Undersecretary for Policy at the International Trade Administration at the Department of Commerce, where our mandate is focused on promoting American exports, enforcing our trade laws, ensuring a level playing field with our trading partners, and attracting foreign investment to the United States. And under the leadership of President Donald J. Trump, we have been working every day to implement his America First trade agenda for the good of American producers and consumers. This agenda, backed by a clear mandate from the American people, is focused on rebalancing our trade relations, securing access to critical supply chains and materials, reindustrializing and prioritizing our own workers, and growing our defense, energy, and finance industries. President Trump's trade priorities are critical because economic security is fundamental to national security. That's why I believe the role of ITA today is more vital than ever, where our job is to help American companies compete and succeed here and around the world. The global economy stands at a pivotal point as advances in critical technologies, including AI, biotech, quantum, and autonomous systems, among others, are poised to drive immense expansions in productivity. The nations that participate in the innovation and adoption of these technologies will be positioned to leap ahead economically to the benefit of their citizens. Recognizing the opportunities that await American producers and consumers and the necessity of protecting American technological independence, President Trump has unleashed innovation like never before. President Trump's America First trade agenda increases our competitive edge, protects our sovereignty, and strengthens our national and economic security. Against this backdrop, recent global events demonstrate how the instruments of national power have evolved. The weaponization of supply chains, technology systems, and economic choke points have hardened a new and deepening geopolitical consensus among U.S. partners on the need to treat economic security as national security. Again and again, we have found American partners are looking to the United States for leadership to secure vital supply chains, remove coercive dependencies, and advance economic security. And that's exactly what President Trump, Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick, and we at ITA are doing every day. This administration is leading through a growing network of new deals and agreements covering technology, trade, minerals, energy, and much more. After decades of a failed agenda of free trade absolutism and globalization, which neither supported domestic industry nor preserved critical supply chains, the United States is now restoring our own independent and reliable access to the goods we need to defend ourselves and preserve our way of life. We are collaborating with our trading partners to strengthen technology protections and develop frameworks that advance shared technology or shared industry standards and safeguard the digital economy. This is why President Trump has prioritized AI as a cornerstone of American innovation, powering a new age of human flourishing, economic competitiveness, and national security with American leadership in science and technology. American industry is working diligently to bring the benefits of artificial intelligence to the world. Right now, America is at a moment of strength with the best chips, the best models, and the best applications. The nations and companies that control the information infrastructure will influence global communications for many years to come. This is why the values of those nations and companies matter so much. As you are all aware, in July, the White House released America's AI Action Plan, which outlined policy recommendations for the U.S. government, including tasking the U.S. Secretary of Commerce to stand up an American AI exports program to support the American AI technology stack worldwide, to strengthen our relationships with our allies, and to secure our continued technological dominance. This program is being established in consultation with the Director of the Office of Science and Technology, or OSTP, and the Secretary of State in a coordinated national effort. In response to this directive from President Trump, Secretary Lutnick has been working to translate this strategy into action and outcomes. We are implementing the American AI Exports Program, starting with a request for information in which we have posed fundamental questions regarding the program's structure and operations, geographic market prioritization, and appropriate federal support mechanisms. As we continue to build this program, we want to hear from you and invite you to participate in the listening process for this program, which opens through December 13th. Visit aiexports.gov or regulations.gov to participate. We need your expertise, your insights, your candid feedback on how we can get this right. We recognize the sheer complexity of these industries and the incentives at play. We are mindful of the Hippocratic Oath in these complex markets and seek precise methods to drive precise outcomes. The stakes are too high and the opportunities too significant for us to move forward without incorporating the perspectives of those who will be directly involved in this effort. We are grateful to those who have shared their perspectives already. We want to hear from American AI companies about what they need in support of their efforts abroad. And we want to hear from our foreign allies and partners, both governments and companies, as the buyers of American AI, about what would be most helpful to them in facilitating that process. We seek to make clear that American goods, services, and technologies are a far better buy in the long run because they are higher quality and do not come with the same kinds of strings as other countries' assistance. We want to have a deep understanding of how we can best unlock American value and values for the world. The American value on offer is the best and most performant AI capabilities at the best possible price, the business proposition. And the American values on offer are, among others, our openness, transparency, trustworthiness, commitment to freedom and innovation, and free market capitalism that continue to make us the global partner of first choice. As nations consider what sovereign AI means to them and how to bring the benefits of AI to their citizens, we want the American AI technology stack to have the most compelling proposition of value and values. Your input will directly inform our program and shape how we deploy federal resources, coordinate diplomatic efforts, and structure how the program works. This is your opportunity to help us build the program that both serves national interests and creates real opportunities for American businesses and their partners abroad. If you care about AI, join the conversation and submit your best ideas. Another area of focus for this administration is the strength of our domestic semiconductor industry. To export the American AI technology stack around the world and offer innovative U.S. technologies to governments and markets seeking the highest quality products, we know the semiconductor industry will play a pivotal role going forward. A single AI server contains thousands of semiconductors. Among these chips, leading-edge processors designed by American companies are the most coveted for AI training and inference. In addition to American-made memory chips, interconnects, and power chips, we know semiconductors are the key to American AI competitiveness, and the American AI Exports Program will help ensure American AI and American chips continue to lead around the globe. And finally, I'll note the Trump administration is committed to ensuring unrestricted global cross-border data flows. In an increasingly digital economy, cross-border data flows underpin innovation and trade, and the proliferation of laws governing and restricting transfers of data threaten to undermine the biggest opportunities of the digital age and emerging technologies. Cross-border data flows depend on two key elements: the interoperability of laws across different markets and trust that data will be protected when it goes to other jurisdictions. We know how important these data flows are to our companies, our economy, and to the U.S. technological leadership and economic security. Simply put, secure cross-border data flows, enable the development and availability of the best possible technology at the best possible price for all of our citizens. With programs like the EU-US Data Privacy Framework and the Global Cross-Border Privacy Rules System, or CBPR, we at the International Trade Administration are committed to helping companies comply with cross-border legal requirements and build trust with our foreign partners for the benefit of U.S. companies. In conclusion, we know all American technology companies provide the most reliable and innovative solutions to the world's challenges. Artificial intelligence is an example of how the United States can lead while recognizing the value of digital sovereignty, data privacy, and technological prosperity for their citizens. That trust, transparency, and security can be expected from AI technology and infrastructure that have been made in America. And our commitment to property rights and freedom, both of which stand guard against threats to digital sovereignty, will never waver as we work to maintain the security of our nation and the prosperity of her people. Thank you all for being here today, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Deputy Undersecretary. It's really a pleasure to be here. And we really appreciate all of your exciting comments about the work of the Commerce Department. I thought maybe we could kick off with just diving in a little bit more on what you're doing on the American AI Exports Program. I know that's a personal passion for you and something you've worked very closely on. The administration has ambitious goals for AI, and we've appreciated hearing President Trump's emphasis that Americans must win the global AI race. As the administration seeks to promote the exports of the full AI stack, how do you define that? What is considered a full stack to you?
Yeah, kind of depends on the context. You can see within the executive order, it lays out some of the definitions. But I think maybe the simplest way to think about it is everything that AI requires. So from power to apps and everything in between.
Great.
There's a lot, yeah.
So I know that you're in listening mode now. I'm sure you're having a lot of really interesting conversations with companies. But as you're getting closer to that December 13 deadline, how do you think that you're going to approach promoting the American AI stack? And sort of what are the expected benefits and incentives for that program for U.S. businesses?
Yeah, I would say maybe I'll describe our approach, which is we want to hear from you what the actual practical benefits would be, what the problems are. We don't want to solve an abstract idea. We want to be grounded in the realities that you all face. So the companies that are already selling around the world, we want to hear from them. But also on the other side, from our foreign allies and partners, those who are buying, what is helpful to you? There's two sides to these transactions. We're here to enable those. So we want to deeply understand those. We want to understand the pain points, and we want to design precise value around those pain points.
Great. So what's the timeline for this process? After you get the comments December 13th, what is the follow-up process for that?
So hopefully we will get lots more feedback. We've received quite a bit so far. Yeah. And then we'll be, talking with Secretary Ludnick, speaking with the Director of OSTP, Michael Kratsios, Secretary of State. There'll be a process there. You'll hear more soon. But I would say all possible speed.
All possible speed.
Yep.
Great. We love speed in the AI realm. Okay, well, changing gears a little bit. This administration's commitment to tech leadership, U.S. tech leadership, and to breaking down barriers to that tech leadership has really been significant. The administration has celebrated some really big successes in the deals with Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Switzerland. What role has the Commerce Department played in those efforts? And can you share some context on how those deals came together?
Yeah, well, you've all seen the headlines. You've seen the role that USTR plays. Secretary of Commerce has been on the trips, been in the deals, et cetera. I would say that you've seen a whole-of-nation effort. You definitely see that the handoffs were aware, and every department playing to its strengths. This is something that's unique about some of the talent that's in the departments right now, with Secretary Ludnick and others who know how to make deals, who know how to drive investment. And I think you saw that come out in Korea and Japan and other places.
Yeah. What are some of the top priorities for the department in the digital space? I know that you've mentioned, your AI work, and I'll ask you about your privacy work in a minute, but what are other digital priorities that you all are really focused on and trying to drive within the group of agencies that are working on these issues in the administration?
Yeah. Digital trade barriers of many forms. Those can be market access. Those can be other kinds of policies that seem technical but have usually the net effect of increasing barriers to American companies, and that may not be grounded in international standards. So we hear from those in a few ways. Sometimes we hear them from companies. Sometimes we see them in our interactions with those countries. And we are advocates. We are there to show up, to advocate for American companies, and to advocate for the policies that enable prosperity on these matters. That's something we've been doing before. I'd say there's a renewed emphasis on that now, and there's a laser focus on it.
Great. So you mentioned in your remarks that ITA has played a huge role in promoting U.S. competitiveness and addressing and administering data flow agreements. I'll say that at the beginning of my career, I worked at the Commerce Department on a data privacy agreement with APEC. So I followed all that work very closely. Can you tell us what is the importance of the free flow of data to American competitiveness?
Yeah, I mean, it's always been important, right? It was important for software, et cetera. It was important for cloud, but now for AI, it's even more important, right? Data flows cut to the core of price and performance for AI. And we're trying to enable that as much as we can. And really, it's to all of our benefit, right? It's not to our collective benefit if every village has their own policy and you need a compliance policy for every single subunit of the world. So we're trying to get to harmonization. We're trying to get to frameworks that make this reasonable and easy, but also protect data and allow for those mechanisms that we're all looking for. So that's where the EU-US data privacy framework, the CBPR, all these things come in, and where we advocate for those is to harmonize regulations, is to make the free flow of data possible, and then really ultimately to enable AI. And that's going to matter quite a bit going forward. It matters a lot now.
Yeah. You mentioned the EU. I didn't start it. You did. The EU, as Deputy USTR Switzer was mentioning in his remarks, the EU has taken a very different approach to tech regulation than the United States. I would argue, to their detriment. How is the Commerce Department thinking about the EU digital regulatory agenda and how to potentially address it?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that we've had some concerns in some ways, and you can look to public statements there. Secretary Lutnick said we've made our concerns known. These are active discussions, so I won't get ahead of the Secretary. But I would say the same principles apply. And we've seen some policies that have gone in other directions that are not, I would say, in either American interest benefit or even in the interests of other countries at times, in their long-term interests. Yeah. As was discussed earlier, that sometimes we feel that other countries are not prioritizing the long term. And we'll say that where we see that, and we have.
Yeah, and besides Europe, where are some countries that you have focused those conversations on in particular?
I mean, a whole lot of places. I would say any large economy where there's a lot of interest, we're very focused. Every country has its own story, so I won't call out specific countries here, but I'll just say the president's recent trip to Asia highlighted a lot of this. This was definitely, in conjunction with USTR, a big focus. And we were looking at particular countries and having a lot of closed-door meetings on those things as well. It will always come up, right? It's really core to part of our trade relationships. It's core to bring the benefits of AI to America and to citizens everywhere.
And looking at the AI export program, are there any particular ideas that you've floated around on how you might use that program to combat some of these problems that you see around the world?
Yes, I would say, everything's on the table right now, so we're hearing everything. But some of the things we've heard have been, what's the eligibility criteria for who's in? What's the quid pro quo on when you're in and when another country is prioritized, and let's say the U.S. government is assisting those other countries, what would we expect on the other side? I think you can expect, and it would make sense, that harmonized digital trade barriers and other such things, privacy frameworks, data flows, et cetera, would be very compatible with us, and that seems to be a prerequisite. It seems to make sense, right? And the more that those things get in the way, the harder it's going to be to harmonize our policies with theirs. That includes export controls as well. Right? So we're looking to build the circle of friends that we can share these benefits with, that we can enable American companies to sell into, and so that now they can take part in the big transformations that are happening and that are coming from AI and the benefits that those bring.
That's really exciting to hear. Just sort of, wrapping up, what can all of us around this room do to help you with this agenda? I think as fans of work to bring down barriers to U.S. companies and our exports, what is the number one thing that we all can do to support you?
Join the conversation. Please submit your ideas. Our nerd factor is high. We will read everything, but submit it all, because we want to be grounded in what you all are living every day. And I know we have industry here, we have trade associations, we have foreign countries here. Let us know what you think. What is helpful to you to sell? What is helpful for you to buy? What is helpful to you in terms of markets and frameworks, et cetera? We want as much in-depth knowledge as we can possibly get.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody. We're going to be getting our next panel up here. It's going to take us just a couple minutes to transition the stage. This is not a formal break, but if you need to run out and fill up your coffee cup, now's the time to do it. We're going to have about 2 or 3 minutes before we come back with the next panel. Please. to the window. Hello, if folks can please take their seats, we're going to get our panel seated. Rob, why don't you come on the end just with your being tall. Which end? This end, and then you two in the middle, wherever you go, and George on the far side. Go ahead, sort that out. Please come on. Who's at the far end? Jordan's going to come.
Perfect. Okay.
Thank you all for your patience as we transition to our panel setup for the rest of the morning. Really delighted to welcome this panel. It's really the theme for this whole Trade and Tech Summit, the U.S. role in global tech leadership. We have a great session planned. We have delighted to have our three guests and our moderator. Whitney Baird is the President and CEO of the United States Council for International Business. Jason Oxman is the President and CEO of the Information Technology Industry Council. Rob Porter is the Chief of Global Affairs Officer at Coupang. And our moderator, Jordan Heiber, who's the Vice President of International Digital Economic Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Thank you all for joining us. Jordan?
Great. Well, thank you so much, and thank you again to our panelists for joining. As Ken said, this is really the framing panel after our two keynote speakers to really set the stage for the rest of this event and to talk about the U.S. role in global tech and digital policy leadership. In the spirit of the season, as we get close to the holidays, we're going to add a Dickensian element to this short discussion and look at things through a lens of digital trade, past, present, and future. In Dickens' tale, A Christmas Carol, this is not a nostalgic journey, it's more diagnostic. So we'll try and take that same approach here as we look very briefly at the path that got us to where we are today, as we take stock of the current digital trade tech policy environment, and then look ahead to the choices that will determine whether and how the U.S. Remains a leader and continues to set the rules of the road or adapts to rules that are potentially created elsewhere, including by adversaries. So briefly, to touch on the ghosts of digital trade past. I don't want to delve too far, but even just looking at the immediate prior administration, I think it's fair to say, I think many in this room and the business community would agree and argue that the Biden administration in the last term, really in the space of digital trade, took a step back from what we saw as traditional tech policy, digital trade leadership. This was evident in the U.S. walking away from JSI negotiations at the WTO. It was evident in the administration's watering down of digital trade provisions in the National Trade Estimate. To be fair, there was a lot happening at that time, recovering from the pandemic, supply chain shocks, but also we're in a very different time now and a different time with this current administration. Rob, I want to start with you because you worked in the last Trump administration. And speaking broadly about trade policy, Ambassador Greer said, I think just last Friday, where we were walking in the first term, now we can run and fly. Having spent time working alongside President Trump during his first term, what are your thoughts, looking more specific to the theme here in digital trade and tech policy, about the agenda that was pursued under Trump 1 versus the approach that's being taken now?
Great question, and thanks very much for the sort of the framing introduction. I suppose we could keep with another Dickens theme and say it's a tale of two administrations, at least in certain respects. My background, both in Congress and the White House, was less what yours and I think Whitney's was in terms of helping negotiate some of the sort of the technical details of various agreements, but rather thinking about trade policy writ large, the overarching priorities and objectives and strategies, either in a multilateral or bilateral context with various countries. And so, in looking at the Trump trade policy, first in 1.0, through that lens, especially the first couple of years, was really, really oriented around two principal things. One, shoring up the domestic industrial base, including the defense industrial base, and that was reflected in things like the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs, as well as countering what the administration described as Chinese economic coercion or economic warfare. And that was reflected in sort of the 301 tariff escalations, export controls, and some similar policies. Those priorities, I think, were broadly reflective in an administration where, even though during the campaign there was a lot of talk of trade and trade policy, it was not populated by very many people with deep trade, legal, or policy backgrounds. And so, those initial priorities were, I think, largely reflective of Ambassador Lighthizer background, experience, and orientation. When you think about what that meant for digital trade and tech, some of the policies vis-a-vis China and in terms of sort of unilateral aggressive action against an adversary were designed to help protect and bolster U.S. technology leadership. And there were, there were various, particular threats with particular trading partners specific to some digital issues, like threats of taking away GSP benefits, India, Indonesia, et cetera, to resolve things. But in general, tech issues and digital trade issues were not at the forefront. Some notable exceptions, USMCA and the U.S.-Japan, I guess, digital trade agreement, I think were some really important steps forward with respect to things like pushing back against data localization, safeguarding algorithms and source code, et cetera. But even there, I think it would be a stretch to say that digital trade and tech issues were a central part of the overarching trade strategy and trade policy. Think about now the second term, and there's still a lot of similarities in orientation in the first term. Industrial base is still very important, China and the relations, although the orientation may have shifted a little bit there, but that's very similar. But there's really, as Jameson said, in terms of running rather than walking, been a significant effort at rebalancing trade relationships globally, a lot to do with sort of reciprocal trade in sort of the Trump administration's conception. But from the very outset, digital trade and technology issues have been at the forefront. And that started very early in the administration. So you think about all the way back in February, the executive order on reciprocal trade talks very centrally about non-tariff barriers and about digital trade and digital trade barriers very prominently in that. Even more so, the presidential memorandum that President Trump signed back in February as well, so right at the outset of the administration, even before reciprocal tariff day, et cetera, whose title I think was something like Defending U.S. Companies Against Overseas Extortion and Unfair Penalties and Fines, was focused primarily on digital trade issues. And got very specific about digital services tax and digital services regulations and cross-border data flows and sort of a whole range of very specific digital trade priorities. And that orientation, those directives to USTR on commerce and others, I think have been very much borne out by the way in which the administration has sought to negotiate a lot of these bilateral trade deals, has been reinforced by President Trump's continuing personal interest in this. In August, a Truth Social post where, again, he I don't know if he used the word extortion, but essentially said, U.S. big tech companies should not be the world's piggy banks, and name-checked DSTs and platform regulation and other digital trade priorities. And I think you're starting to see some of those, both at a broad level and even with some specifics that have very much become a central part of the trade agreements that have been negotiated, some of the fact sheets that have been released, and in many respects, a reorientation of our trade policy writ large.
Thanks. And Jason, Rob briefly mentioned USMCA, and we've just had 3 days of testifying at the ITC with the USTR on the future of USMCA. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your thoughts on how the administration should approach this review, especially in the context of digital trade, and especially considering the high standards that have already been incorporated into that agreement, and really any risks you see going forward.
Thanks, Jordan. And great to be here with all of you. Great to be here with Whitney and Rob. Congratulations to Ken and WITA for putting on this inaugural event. Obviously, a lot of demand given all of you in the room. Appreciate Ken bringing us all together. WITA does great work. And appreciate Ken bringing the Chicago weather with him as well. Not a Bears victory, but Chicago weather. So it was one out of two that you could do. It's a really important and timely topic, Jordan. And I'm sorry, I'm required to start with a Dickensian reference, right? Best of times, worst of times. You took that one already. But actually, interesting enough, A Tale of Two Cities is about how different people experience the same economy in different ways, right? The French and the English, the wealthy and the not so wealthy. I'll leave it there. It's probably enough. This is an enormously important topic and timely, as you noted, because comments have just gone in to USTR. If you haven't submitted comments to USTR, it's never too late to let the administration know how important you think it is to renew the agreement. And just for those who, there's nobody in the room who doesn't know what we're talking about here, but just so the one or two people who might, there is a deadline for USTR to submit a recommendation to Congress. That deadline is, I think, has been calculated as January 2nd. That recommendation is whether to continue the agreement. Now, there's an urgent part to that, which is that there's a decision that's going to be made by 180 days, July, mid next year. But the agreement, of course, runs through 2036. So there's a bit of an urgent timetable, and then there's a not so urgent timetable. But the piece that's urgent is to make sure that the administration understands from all of us and from our constituencies that this agreement is very important. And there is a real risk, and I think we've seen some signs of that message being delivered to the administration, that the agreement either gets canceled or renegotiated. There have been some administration officials who have suggested that because the economies of Mexico and Canada are so different, it makes sense to pursue separate tracks for renegotiation. The idea of a single market in North America was, I think, a genius move by the first Trump administration. So credit there for doing that. If you look at the global trade marketplace, our number one trading partner in the U.S., if you look at individual countries, obviously Canada and Mexico are important, but actually our single largest trading partner is the EU. So the idea of a single market is not a bad idea, and it was a good idea in the first Trump term. It's a good idea now. As to the digital trade provisions that Jordan mentioned, Rob alluded to this as well. Gold standard provisions, the best single trade agreement provisions for digital trade that we'd ever seen, and frankly, a roadmap for agreements going forward. I think it's very important to recognize that in the absence of that digital trade provision in the first round in USMCA, we would still be dealing with telegraph-era trade regulations for the tech industry that the USMCA replaced from NAFTA. And those agreement provisions have been quite literally exported into other discussions around the world. So they are enormously important. The digital trade marketplace is enormously important. It's $1 trillion export market for the U.S. Digital trade is a great story for trade in the U.S. in particular because it's a surplus. It's a $300 million surplus market for us. So it's something that we should continue to focus on. It's something we should continue to emphasize. And it's something that the U.S. leads the world in. So it's enormously important that we not only continue the agreement itself writ large as a whole, but that we also continue to negotiate those digital trade provisions as well internationally. The last thing I'll mention on USMCA is there are, of course, issues that we need to resolve, non-tariff barriers in particular. We've seen discussions in Canada of moving forward with a digital service tax, which fortunately seems to be moving in a positive direction, but that's an example of something that can interfere with trade, but that we can resolve outside of the idea of opening up the trade agreement and starting over. Local content restrictions also, we've seen those in Canada as well, and we're trying to deal with those. Those are challenges to trade. They're non-tariff barriers that we need to address, but they don't require opening the agreement back up again. Similarly, in Mexico, we've seen a lot of discussion of moving parts across the border back and forth, and there are some concerns that the U.S. government has with how that's done, but that's what USMCA is designed to facilitate. If there are complaints or issues that need to be addressed, it can be done outside of reopening the agreement. So as you can tell, our bottom line recommendation to USTR and to the administration writ large is this agreement is working. Let's continue to move it forward. Let's continue it into the future, and let's resolve any issues that we have with Canada and Mexico outside of the idea of opening the agreement up and starting all over again.
Thank you, Jason. Could not agree more. Whitney, this question is a little bit, this is going to steal a little bit from the Ghosts of Digital Trade Future segment, but tying together your current work now with USCIB and your career at the State Department, and especially the work in economic policy and trade policy. I know you were PDAS in the E-Bureau, the Economic Bureau. Do you see a future in which the U.S. gets back to a more traditional trade negotiation approach, agreements that are negotiated over lengths of time that are presented to Congress, or do you think that's something in the past?
Thanks very much, and thank you to all for being here today. And I don't know about you, but I do feel the ghost of Christmas. It's freaking freezing. And the second thing is, I would just like to echo Jordan's, for our members, the importance of USMCA and that North American market are intense. We testified this last week, and we have put in, I think, a strong statement in support of the USMCA review staying in and treating it, I think, as if at all possible, as a single agreement. Look, I bear, like many here, I bear the scars of TPP and certainly the scars of TTIP, which I saw both in Washington, but then once I got out to London and kind of watched what happened there. I think realistically, since we'll call it the demise of the Doha round, I just think over this period of time in the US and the electorate, there has just really been a reduction in support for this idea of continued globalization and these really large trade agreements. And so what we've seen is this administration, I think, has kind of taken advantage of a bit of that gap, and they've moved out very smartly on executive actions on trade. I guess as a longtime bureaucrat, so to speak, I do kind of wonder at some point if Congress isn't going to wake up and reassert its role in interstate commerce and looking at the agreements that are being done. What's the difference between an agreement that is ratified by Congress and agreed by Congress, and then an agreement that is an executive action agreement, and the longevity of those? But all of that sort of aside, I don't feel any push or any mood to take on a really large, multifaceted set of negotiations. I just, that pendulum may swing back, but I don't see it anytime soon. And frankly, I don't think the space in the WTO is there for that kind of agreement either. What I would say, and maybe this harkens back to the USMCA, I think we have seen a number of the actions by this administration in pursuing bilateral agreements. There are many elements that are positive. I do feel this is, continuing to do these on a bilateral basis, I think for our members, for businesses, risks having a multitude of differences in the details. And one of the things that is an advantage of a large FTA negotiation, whether it's with an individual country or whether it's a more multilateral kind of negotiation, is you get negotiated out sort of as smoothing across the details, so you don't have frictions and differences in agreements with different entities and different countries at the basic level. Usually there's a baseline that USTR negotiates from that's fairly predictable. And for us, I would say if we were asking something from the administration is really taking on, having looked at TTIP, say, if I could say my ghost of Christmas future, would be engaging in the regulatory space in a major way with the European Union, with the Commission and with the multitude, particularly as the Commission right now and the European Union as a whole is reviewing its own regulatory approach. So particularly in things like DMA, DSA, if we're looking at digital markets, but across the board in due diligence reporting and across the board, these are things that affect our member companies really directly. The other risk, I think, is the EU is pretty active in promoting those standards as standards that are useful as global standards. And so I know in the case of Korea and elsewhere with DMA and some other issues there, we have important trading partners that then take on. So that's a long way around to say the basic answer is no, but we see a lot of opportunities in the spaces.
You brought us very well into the ghosts of digital trade present, and in speaking about the bilateral deals that are being announced, that are being negotiated. I think that if you look back at the first couple months of those negotiations, of those announcements, there was less emphasis on the tech policy side, on the digital trade side. It was much more focused on investment commitments, on purchases. But if you look just in the last couple months, we've seen announcements, and it was talked about earlier this morning, from East Asia to Latin America that have really incorporated elements of pushing back on discriminatory policies, on commitments to data flows on digital services taxes, network fees, and other issues. We've also now have, just in the last month and a half, a confirmed ambassador to the WTO, which is very important as we look to U.S. leadership in the digital trade and the technology space going forward. Whitney, sticking with you and looking at MC14, the ministerial next March, as always, the e-commerce moratorium will be on the agenda, and the U.S., to its credit, is pushing quite hard, not just for an extension of the moratorium, but calling for permanence. Can you talk just very briefly, and I think most in the room, again, are very familiar, but just about the importance of ensuring either the permanence or at least the extension of the moratorium. And beyond the WTO, if there are other international organizations, especially in the next year, that will be really critical to U.S. tech policy leadership.
Sure. So the e-commerce moratorium, yes, is enormously important to our member companies. I will say going into MC14, it certainly feels like we're in a little more positive space with strong support from the administration, clearly stated, and as you said, really advocating for a permanent moratorium, because going into MC13, I don't think we had quite the same feel, and certainly with Indonesia, India, and some other countries, there was, I think, some question whether there would be an extension of the moratorium at all. I mean, at least pleased to see out of MC13, we got the 2-year, we got the extension and it's coming back up. Certainly what I'm hearing from Geneva, and I hope that this is the case, is with the US pressing for a permanent moratorium. There are others who have proposed, a 6-year, a 10-year, a 5-year. I mean, there are things out there, but what it certainly does sound to me more like, the question is not if there will be an extension of the moratorium, but it's more like the negotiation on what will the term be, which is a much better place to be starting from. It's enormously important. I think without the moratorium, it throws a lot of digital trade. It just adds a layer of uncertainty. It certainly raises costs. I think the compliance and just the compliance regimes to deal with a range of tariffs on digital transmissions would be an enormous expense and really, I think, create a lot of frictions. We don't need more frictions in this space. And again, I think there would be an enormous effect on certainly our member, U.S. companies, which are leaders, but frankly, around the world, there are any number of smaller operators in the developing world who depend on digital platforms to build their own businesses, and there would, in fact, be an outsized effect on them. So we see every reason for, we hope, a permanent moratorium. I think what's more likely to occur is something, I hope, that is more lengthy and we aren't dealing with this 2-year cycle at the very least, and we get a more positive outcome than we had from MC13.
Thanks. And Rob, in terms of the bilateral reciprocal negotiations that are taking place, Coupang, I understand, operates in more than 160 markets, but your key market, your largest market, of course, is South Korea. And we've just in the last few weeks have had an announcement in terms of the investment framework between the US and South Korea, and some commitments from the Koreans, I think, on the digital trade side. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to those and their importance for Coupang, but also perhaps extrapolate from that what could be taken from that agreement and some of these other agreements that we've had recent announcements on as the US administration continues to negotiate with other countries.
Yeah, absolutely, and would love to pick up on a couple themes, a couple things that we've heard thus far in the discussion. One is of the sort of the USMCA as the original gold standard for digital trade provisions, and then the second is, I think a common concern among those that are less than enthused about the demise of the multilateral trading system, and point out some of the limitations or perhaps deficiencies of simple sort of bilateral agreements. In my mind, the South Korean, the joint fact sheet as of a few weeks ago, I think in many respects can be seen as a new type of gold standard for digital trade provisions, but also I think can point to some of the benefits of having bilateral deals that can go into sort of greater specificity related to particular problems, particular barriers, particular sort of pernicious actions in various markets. So just a quick primer on sort of the South Korea deal. It's not going to be a model for every bilateral trade deal moving forward, just because of some of its unique natures. It's comprehensive, not in the sense of being detailed, but in the sense that it has a big investment pillar, $350 billion worth of investments with some complicated mechanisms and sort of a lot of detail there. It also has a big security component. One of the pillars talking about geopolitical alliance, military, other things. And the trade pillar, I suppose, is also not going to be a model for every bilateral agreement, because given chorus and the multiple negotiations, renegotiations there, tariff levels not particularly important, sort of the commercial considerations in the sense of purchases, to deal with sort of short-term bilateral trade imbalances, not especially relevant in the Korean context. So the focus of the trade pillar is very much on non-tariff barriers. And in addition to some of the standard language related to protection of intellectual property rights and labor and environmental standards, et cetera, there's a surprisingly strong and detailed language on some of the key non-tariff barriers. Agriculture, certainly motor vehicle standards, but digital services, digital trade is really sort of the centerpiece of that. And for a fact sheet that's only 3.5 pages of text, a surprisingly robust set of language related to digital trade, and some of the priorities that are applicable in general and across lots of different markets, and that could be incorporated as sort of a model along with some of the other Southeast Asian agreements that Ambassador Switzer referenced. But also some issues that are particularly problematic. Korea. So there's specific language on network usage fees, on online platform regulation. That's something that the Korean government, the National Assembly, has threatened to move forward with. On exports, not just data flows in general, but export of maps data, which is sort of a somewhat unique issue for South Korea now. And so I think it can be both a model for some of the general issues that are raised in digital trade, but also some of the ways in which these bilateral agreements can go into detail on some of the somewhat unique or somewhat nuanced particular issues, particular threats, particular barriers that the U.S. interests, U.S. companies face in various markets. The last thing that I'd say is that I think it's also something of a model for the way in which, to its credit, USTR and Commerce have really sought in some of these negotiations, not just for it to be a temporary pause of tariffs based on some sort of concessions or compensation for trade imbalances, but can really set the framework for industrial alliances and technology alliances between countries. You look at the investment provisions in the South Korea deal, it's focused on shipbuilding, advanced manufacturing, batteries, a whole host of things that are very relevant for what the U.S. needs in terms of reinvigorating our industrial base. Think about a lot of the technology provisions. It does a nice job, I think, of setting a framework for synergies between the U.S. and Korea, where Korea is one of the leaders in a lot of sort of like AI hardware and semiconductors chips. U.S. obviously in AI software and models, and some of the ways in which the countries can work together to form a technology alliance that I think hopefully will endure beyond some of the sort of the particular provisions and particular interests motivating sort of this tariff dial down in the short run.
And Jason, we've talked a little bit about USMCA, about WTO, about these bilateral negotiations and deals that are being announced. As we look especially at 2026, what else is out there? Are there other frameworks? Are there other policy imperatives to U.S. digital trade and tech policy leadership that we haven't talked about that really should be on our radar?
Yeah, here's the good news. The Trump administration obviously is very focused on entering into trade agreements. Their USTR is literally traveling the world, entering into discussions. We've seen a lot of great forward progress. Jordan, in your opening remarks, you alluded to the somewhat disappointing Biden administration trade focus. If DOGE were operating during the Biden administration, they would have taken the T back from USTR as a cost-saving measure because they should have forfeited it. There just wasn't anything happening. Now it's happening, and it's happening at an accelerated pace, and I think that's a very good thing. So we're in a good position heading into 2026. Here's the thing that gives me a little bit of concern. We heard from Ambassador Switzer this morning, the administration's view correctly that the U.S. is the most important market in the world. It's the most important market for U.S. companies. It's the most important market for international companies. But we also hear, meanwhile, and remembering that 95% of the people who live on the planet do not live in the United States, we hear that even though China is exporting a lot less to the U.S., I think down about 29% last month, China, for the first time in history, first time any country in history, has a $1 trillion export market for this year. And this year isn't over yet. So they passed $1 trillion with 11 months of the year reporting. In other words, China is trading with the rest of the world. and the rest of the world is trading with China. They're traveling the world. We all know about the Belt and Road Initiative. This is something they've been doing for a very long time. So we still have to be worried about who's picking up the slack if we're not leaning in to trade negotiations. It's very, very important. And we're doing that. And I think the Trump administration is to be applauded for all the work they're doing to enter into these agreements. So I think the short answer to your question, Jordan, what's next for 2026? Let's keep doing it. Let's keep leaning in. Let's keep striking bilateral, multilateral, whatever kind of engagements we can do. The reversals from the Biden administration have been stark in the trade area. WTO, what Whitney talked about. It was amazing to me. I went to Geneva during the Biden administration, trying to convince the U.S. delegation that the country that invented the internet opposes the imposition of tariffs on e-commerce. Why am I having this conversation? We're in the Reagan building, so I suppose I forgot to make my Dickens reference. I'm sorry. We're in the Reagan building, so we should remember the Christmas Carol is Dickens was the original inventor of the concept of trickle-down economics. The WTO e-commerce tariff moratorium is the best example of that. As Whitney noted, small businesses around the world benefit from it. So a lot of good work coming, a lot of good things to happen. We're pleased with the work the Trump administration has been doing. We want to see more of it.
Thanks. So I made the moderator's error, which is spending a lot of time on Acts 1 and Act 2 and not enough time on Act 3, and we only have a few minutes left. But that's the ghosts of digital trade future. And I think I'll just ask one question and allow all three of you to respond, because the theme of this conference is on U.S. leadership. But other countries are also pursuing their own agendas. And you can talk about that in the context of tech sovereignty. You can talk about it in the context of other countries pursuing trade deals that are more traditionally negotiated trade deals or regional agreements. I'd love to get all three of your take in the remaining few minutes that we have left about how the U.S. can approach those challenges, how the U.S. can partner with countries, but how the U.S. can also push back when issues like tech sovereignty erode the ability of U.S. companies to compete. So, Jason, perhaps we'll start with you, and then to Whitney, and we'll conclude with Rob.
Sure. Timely question. I was in Brussels a couple of weeks ago. I think on the issue of tech sovereignty, the idea that the Brussels effect is having an impact on Europe and their ability to invest is absolutely right. But at the same time, I think there are positive signs. So heading into 2026, the future of global trade, love to see the EU continue its focus on the tech simplification agenda, reduction of regulations. The Draghi report, if you haven't had a chance to look at it, highlights how harmful the regulatory environment in Europe has been to investment in Europe. So that's something I think is very important to continue to move forward. Positive signs out of Brussels, but we'll see how that goes in 2026. I think other things to keep an eye on are non-tariff barriers. We've been talking a lot about trade agreements and the importance of trade agreements, absolutely the case, but the non-tariff barriers is really where the action is, I think, in 2026, from digital services taxes to cross-border data flows, from local testing and certification requirements for equipment to moves around the world to attach the security of a product to where its geographic headquarters, if its corporate parent are, cloud sovereignty, all these kind of non-tariff barriers. These are things we really need to be focused on and paying attention to in 2026, because they pose as much, if not more, of a challenge to the ability of U.S. companies to compete globally than to do the trade agreements. So that's what I keep an eye on for 2026.
Great. So what I would say is, so separately, I would go back to the enabling environment for U.S. innovation and growth in the tech sector very broadly. And I think we face a bit of a challenge. We have an administration that is frankly quite skeptical of international organizations and multilateral entities as the means for delivering economic standards and policy. And yet there are really important standard-setting bodies like the ITU, and others where we really would like to see the U.S. weigh in a very positive way to promote a set of technical standards that allows next generation technologies for the U.S. to be in a privileged position, that there's a lot of space for innovation, whether it's low Earth orbit, constellation, whether it's quantum computing, and frankly, continually on AI and AI governance, ensuring that that's done in a way that doesn't inhibit really U.S. Company innovation, et cetera. And then if I can circle back more broadly, I think we have to be paying attention broadly to issues of cybercrime and scams. Because one of the areas that's really important for U.S. companies' success is a level of trust. A trust in the data flows, a trust in privacy, trust in how the data is being handled. I think we feel that strongly, but I think scams and cybercrime are two areas that really affect that trust, both at a governmental level, but also at a personal level for the consumers who are actually using the technologies. So these are, we want to see the continued success, and there are a couple of ways outside of these kind of trade-related agreements we can do that.
Thank you. Rob?
You definitely highlighted the big challenge that I think lies ahead for a Trump administration that has purposefully been very disruptive, that as Whitney notes, is very skeptical. I think that's even a generous term of multilateral institutions and of sort of globalization writ large. So what does the transition look like from a series of bilateral negotiated agreements, largely driven by sticks of tariffs, to how can the U.S. continue with its trade leadership and use various carrots, commercial collaborations, industrial partnerships, technology alliances, to continue to be the center of gravity and a leader in terms of not only bilateral but broader discussions, standards, et cetera, even in a new world where we're less reliant on those formal institutions and have something more than just the size of the U.S. economy and of its import market, but U.S. leadership on substance as well.
Well, thank you. We could talk all morning about this, but Ken won't let us.
We'll murder you.
So please join me in thanking our panelists for their expertise, for humoring my Christmas Carol analogy. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks very much to our panel. I was trying to think about where to slip in. Please, sir, can I have some more? But I don't think that has to do with the tariffs. So with that, we'll thank our panel. Ask our next panel to please go towards the back to get mic'd up. We are not having a formal break again, so please don't try to leave your seats. I will take a second, since I have your attention, to bring your attention to a few upcoming events at WITA. Next week, we'll be hosting a webinar titled WTO Matters with some key leaders to talk about the future of the World Trade Organization, as well as a series of events we'll be starting in January to break down some of the critical issues facing the World Trade Organization in advance of MC14. That'll be a series we do every couple of weeks, a webinar online. We're also going to be hosting again our Congressional Trade Agenda program, which is our annual program with the 4 trade councils. It'll be in this room. It'll be a hybrid event on February 6th. On February 23rd and 24th, we'll be hosting our Washington International Trade Conference. That's also a hybrid event. It'll be online on Monday the 23rd and in person on Tuesday the 24th of February in this room. And for those of you who are WITA sponsors or would like to sponsor WITA, our annual dinner is coming up in July. It always sells out. Recommend you get your reserve a table today. That's on July 22nd. So a few WITA commercials we want to just bring to your attention. We'll also be hosting our USMCA review series, which will continue in 2026 with regular events looking at the renewal, the review, and perhaps renewal of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. So with that, we'll just take just a brief second before we welcome our next panel. Yeah. Small fish. Oh, yeah. I don't know. You know what's happening. But you're doing well. Are you? Oh, wow. Are you still going to dabble in a open? Yeah. All right, folks can please take their seats. Folks can take their seats. We're going to get started. John, if you can take the far seat. Thank you, Matt. Good to see you.
Anyone?
I understand we need to get you out of here.
Yeah, just right on time.
Right on time, we're good.
Okay,
I will
thank
handle.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for sticking around still. We have an exciting panel now, panel 2, working with partners, trade, the innovation, and the AI stack. You know, the last panel brought up the theme of Dickens, and I think the book that jumps to mind for this panel for me is Great Expectations. So we're not going to be Tale of Two Cities for this one. Really delighted to have you here. Emily Benson is the head of strategy at Minerva. Amy Morgan is Vice President of Trade Compliance at Altana. Matt Schroers is the President and CEO of the Computer and Communications Industry Association. And our moderator is John Corrigan, the Senior Director for Trade and Industrial Strategy at Silverado Policy Accelerator. Thrilled to have you all here with us today. Bios for all our speakers are on the programs. There's a card on the table with a barcode, and you can click that and see their full bios. John?
Thank you very much, Ken, and thanks to WITA for having us. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you. As we were hit with a sort of deluge of Dickens references during the prior panel, my thought was just avoid the word bleak. Probably his best book, but let's talk about Great Expectations. And in a sense, you know, moving on, I don't think A Christmas Story actually went into January, but one kind of approach I want to take with this panel is thinking about New Year's resolutions, because of everything that happened this past year as we look at executive orders, documents like America's AI Action Plan, and various trade agreements, frameworks, joint statements, and agreements in principle, we can think of them as sort of resolutions about what the United States is doing on trade going forward in 2026 and beyond. So on this panel, we'll sort of get in the weeds a bit more relative to what the Deputy Undersecretary covered and what our colleagues covered on the prior panel, touch on goods trade a bit and focus on AI. So, you know, in looking at the panel title, I seized on the concept of working with partners. So touching on that point, I wanted to start with Matt and really take stock, as Jordan mentioned during the prior panel, about where we are right now at the end of 2025, and take today as one sort of bookend, and then look back at Q1, roughly 2018, where the United States took actions on issues related to intellectual property theft and forced technology transfer in a bilateral sense vis-a-vis China, but obviously with global implications. And taking that as a starting point going forward to today to think about how does CCIA and its members view openness and innovation as possible today relative to that point in time?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And thanks to WITA for organizing today's event and to Ken for the invitation. I think that's really helpful framing and scene setting. As Jason mentioned on the previous panel, now digital services, digitally delivered services are like a nearly $300 billion surplus. The trade deficit would be like a third again higher, but for the digital sector. And if you look back to that time frame compared to now, digitally delivered services, the ICT services in the economy have increased by something like close to 30%, while the rest of the services exports in the economy, their share has declined more than 10%. So in the prior decade, when we looked at digital services, there were often niche issues that were sort of viewed as ancillary to the bigger part of the U.S. economy, the U.S. export economy. And today they are the core to it, right? It is an increasingly important part of our economy. And it's really no longer useful to even think about how about digital services as a sector of our export economy, because it's infused throughout just about everything we do. And so as we are looking to expand our trade with trading partners, ensuring that the market is open to innovation-enabled services is essential to our exports. And that's why I think it's so critical to think about the nexus between technology and trade, because it's increasingly the same thing.
Okay. And given developments vis-a-vis China and sort of impacts that has had on U.S. trade relationships with additional countries, how do you see sort of the sort of potential or space permissible for the pace and sort of distribution of innovation, given the trade dynamics over the past decade or so?
Yeah. So I think I'd say two things there is, first, as I mentioned before, initially I think we looked at these kinds of issues as niche issues, and increasingly, because so much of the economy is digitally enabled, the speed at which we can enter new markets, at which small businesses can scale, is determined by their access to technology. And so when you see things like the OECD estimating that digital trade barriers have increased by 25%, then that really tells us that our opportunities to grow are directly connected to access to technology. And if digitally enabled services cannot export to our trading partners, that doesn't just affect what we think of as like the digital sector, but just about everything that is digitally enabled is at risk, which is why it's so critical to treat digital barriers as synonymous with trade barriers writ large.
Excellent, thanks. Emily, did you want to jump in on the concept of sort of the changed landscape relative to 2018?
Yeah, sure. Let me first pick up on a backdrop theme of today, which is to quote authors from cold jurisdictions. And I'm not the biggest Dickensian reader, so let me quote Tolstoy here. Everyone thinks of changing the world, but few think of changing himself. And with that, I would like to go back very briefly to the first panel, which talked very briefly about European regulation. I think it's very important to collectively reacquaint ourselves with the trials and tribulations that befell the continent throughout the 20th century. This extends not only, of course, to the decade of the 30s, but far beyond to the spread of autocracy, particularly in the East. And so we should remember that as we're really reevaluating rules and regulations that are intended at the very baseline to preempt that sort of governance from emerging in the future. So I think that's important when we talk about the changed landscape to today, when we see this increasing melding together of what you just referenced, which is that technology and trade are increasingly inseparable. That certainly applies to the digital realm. If you actually go back about 15 years to the first stage of proliferation of cloud services, there was this idea that was fundamentally incorrect at the time, that cloud and data transfers were happening somewhere up here, like a weather pattern. And what we've collectively come to know very viscerally, especially since the month of April, is that data centers, cloud services are incredibly reliant on the free exchange of goods and services that underpin the very architecture of the internet. If you look at a data center, there are tens of thousands of components ranging, of course, from advanced GPUs, but also to very unsexy things like trays that hold up a server rack. It's basically like your grandmother's cookie sheet, for lack of a better term. And all of these are under increasing pressure from various regulatory points. Tariffs, of course, are in the news very prominently, but if you go back to the NDAA packages in 2019, 2023, for example, with Section 5949, there are growing pressures to de-risk from certain inputs into these value chains. Section 5949, for example, says if you contract with the Pentagon, you cannot obtain chips produced by a set of covered entities. So there are a lot of pressures that are continuing down a very direct path that call on companies to de-risk, and at the same time, they're forced to contend with a very uncertain tariff future. And I think combined, that is actually putting pressures on some of the ability of the US not only to maintain resiliency of its own tech sector, but also that could have lasting impacts on our ability to export.
Thanks. Amy, anything to add there?
Well, yeah, it's kind of a personal one. So I'll add, I remember 2018 vividly because it's actually what set me on the path to Altana. So as a practitioner, I think I'm the only practitioner at the conference today. I'm a trade compliance professional. The tariffs were the headliner for me. So tariffs got top billing. But it wasn't until later that I realized that the fine print of the 301 findings in the report, that's where it was revealed, like the real story, right? Companies finally discovered that trade isn't this linear thing. That just happens in a nice clean line. It's actually a network-shaped problem. So companies aren't just dealing with isolated tier one suppliers of their goods, of their grandmother's cookie sheets and the things. They're actually operating inside these really complicated networks, and you can't protect your IP innovation if you only know your tier one suppliers, because the risks tend to not exist there, they exist further out. So that reframing actually changed everything about the way I think about trade business and why I'm really excited to be here representing Altana today. But I'll also mention that it also explains why so much of the new regulation that we're experiencing now in tech products and otherwise are so network shaped. For forced labor, component level tariffs, origin validations, all of these things are all now network shaped issues. So fortunately, we're in a position where AI can help accelerate this notion now, so everyone can start to realize that trade isn't linear, it's actually network shaped. So
I appreciate that phrase, network shaped problem, and it's a good way to turn to sort of set of documents that we all read in July, starting with America's AI Action Plan, the accompanying executive order, and I believe as the Deputy Undersecretary referenced, this Friday is the deadline for the RFIs there. So I want to turn to Emily and talk about, as we all experience 2025 and think forward to 2026, what sort of through lines do you see between the U.S. export intent indicated in the action plan following through to the EO, and then the language that we've seen in the agreements thus far, be they the agreements with Malaysia, Cambodia, or joint statements, or what have you. How are these objectives, how can they be operationalized and implemented based on the text that we've seen thus far, and what sort of additional priorities do you think could help lead us into 2026?
Yeah, so backing up a step, I think it's important to contextualize what the administration is trying to do on AI and with its more general trade policy agenda. And I am of the opinion that the administration is really putting forward a Fortress America approach, as we also heard in the first panel. The idea is essentially to induce onshoring of production to the United States. And depending on who you talk to, that's either relegated primarily to critical sectors, advanced tech, or even if you talk to other people, basically the entire economy. And I know Secretary Lutnick made comments to that effect over the summer. When it comes to the administration's overall approach, a lot of their tariff agenda is very closely interlinked in service of revitalizing the defense industrial base. So you have this attempt to create a North America that is resilient, that can withstand any sort of supply chain disruption coming down the pike. This, of course, came out of a lot of difficult lessons learned in COVID supply chain disruptions. There are a lot of colleagues here from my former unit at the Commerce Department who are doing some of, in my opinion, the US government's best work on exactly this question, how to shore up what we need in order to keep the proverbial lights on. The one exception to this strategy is on a very intensive AI export plan. And this is what was contained in the July agenda that was put forth, and of course the RFIs that are due this Friday. The administration is trying to simplify for foreign governments the ability to procure a US tech stack. As I understand it, there's a priority to go after middle powers here, so it's not everyone at the same time. There's a very geopolitical objective in trying to make it easy for governments and private sector entities abroad to procure a stack. So what is the stack? I think depending on the level of granularity, we can look at rare earth elements like dysprosium, for example, of course, energy supplies, but then moving upwards through semiconductors, assembled racks that mostly come from Mexico in our context, and then up through cloud services and the app economy on top of it. So the idea here is to create one stack, make it easy to procure. And of course, part of the background noise here is to create a more direct peer competitor to Huawei products. A lot of questions have come out of the private sector in recent months. Who can participate? Is the US government going to pick winners and losers? Will one semiconductor company be able to provide the baseline infrastructure, and then will a separate one cloud service provider build on top of that in a sort of ordained, you must do this one stack? I think the administration has signaled they are not going to do this one stack approach where they pick winners and losers. They certainly have gotten the message that a flexible approach with high degrees of interoperability is the way to go. Another major question that's come up quite frequently is the degree to which foreign partners will be able to participate in a stack. And I think in the first iteration of the idea coming from the White House was make it an American stack. Well, actually, it turns out if you're selling abroad, the ultimate end user would like to see some of their own products in the stack. So if you think, for example, about a German power chip producer, I think they would like to participate, or think of Korean high bandwidth memory chips that are critical to storing the data that actually hosts a lot of the training for advanced artificial intelligence systems. And so zooming out, I do think that the administration will move forward on some sort of flexible approach that allows for the integration of foreign firms from high trust countries. The last point I'll make on the AI action plan is that there are a couple of very unresolved questions where I think the administration will have some difficulty in presenting a unified front, especially with Congress getting involved. And that is on the national security and export control front. So I think we're all broadly familiar in this room with last year's AI diffusion rule. We haven't gotten a lot of clarity about the ultimate intention of dealing with the export control question on the stack. That will be complicated, very complicated for a lot of different reasons, but it would serve, I think, all of us collectively quite well to have additional clarity on which markets are fair game and which are not. That's a very undecided question at the moment. There are several bills in Congress that would see greater scrutiny of these deals or to codify certain export control themes that have not historically been codified. And so at the end of the day, we certainly have our work cut out for us, but I'm confident that within the next couple of months, we'll have a much better idea of what exactly the product is for export.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And, you know, I especially appreciate that you touch on sort of imports related to infrastructure development here and just the practical realities of facilitating or enabling exports from the United States as requiring certain abilities within our own borders. So generally speaking, Matt, I just want to turn to you in terms of CCIA and your members as we look to export and engage globally. How do members look at current policy and sort of their ability to improve production within the United States as we look at certain import policies and you know, how do they approach both sides of the coin? Obviously wanting to export, but facing certain challenges on the U.S. import side.
Well, I think it's just so I'll join in saying, you know, that the AI action plan is a welcome development, and particularly that it has this emphasis on exports. So many of the imports that we're talking about, particularly semiconductors included, are ultimately inputs to services that we re-export, right? And that most of increasingly the customers for our services exports are abroad. And so thinking about part of the stack being these critical platform services that are utilizing this infrastructure, including chips, to reach global markets, I think is important. I think that's evident in administration policy, and it indicates, I think, how essential it is that we focus on challenges to platform services and markets abroad that are, of course, reliant on these imports. And maybe just to touch on a few examples of that, we see as digital services are going into overseas markets, as sort of the final link in these elaborate supply chains, and they're encountering opaque and unjust legal processes. I know you ruled out Bleak House, but I'll fulfill my apparent contractual obligation to say that, like, you know, the story of unjust and interminable legal proceedings is sort of the theme of Bleak House, and often what these platform regulations become in overseas markets. You know, it's the mentioning the Brussels effect, right? We sort of started to see these systems like the DMA and the DSA. And efforts to export that framework into other markets. These are rule systems that are generally gerrymandered around U.S. exporters, and, you know, through a system of whether it's revenue constraints that conveniently scope out local stakeholders and scope in U.S. exporters. Or regulatory structures that are designed around products that are only exported from the U.S. You know, we're seeing a lot of systems like this that have the effect of being, you know, non-tariff trade barriers. And so I think if we see resolving those as part of the stack enablement that the administration is focused on, I think that would be a very welcome development.
Excellent, thanks. So, you know, again, we have our resolutions and we have our network-shaped problem that if anything, is probably becoming a more pressing problem as time goes on, as now various actors around the world understand the game that's being played and are sort of taking their approaches more aggressively. But Amy, I want to turn to Altana. And you obviously all are well positioned to illuminate the supply chain dynamics around everything that's happening in ways that were not previously possible. Can you explain the genesis of Altana's product passports and how they can be used to enhance trade in IT goods and services?
Oh yes, this is, I'm a wind-up doll right now talking on this, but I do want to say something that kind of sets me up to answer that question that just sort of hit me as I was sitting here, is there's a little bit of irony here. The AI action plan actually assumes that there's a level of supply chain visibility and partner coordination that our current trading system was never designed for. So, you know, it's only AI can actually deliver that visibility. So to govern AI, we need AI. It's like starts to spin your brain around anyway. But that leads me to Altana and what we're doing with our product passports. The core idea actually came from recognizing the tension that modern supply chains have evolved with the systems built to regulate them have not. So for the last 30-some years, trade enforcement has revolved around the direct cross-border transaction, the direct import of something, the direct export of something. And that worked when our supply chains were simpler. They were cleaner, more vertically integrated. But today, a product like a smartphone or a server is effectively a network. You mentioned it earlier, Emily, where one product can have hundreds of suppliers, shared factories, they're constantly changing their components, and they're spread across multiple continents. And it's not just the movement of that finished good that we need to be concerned with. So while regulators were asking companies to prove things like that the old infrastructure was just never set up to surface, things like multi-tier origins, forced labor exposures, dual use risks, component level tariffs, all these things. So we recognize that tension existed, and I mentioned earlier that our global trade is a network-shaped problem. Well, a network-shaped problem needs a network-shaped solution. So that's why we launched our product passport. So I'm not going to give everybody a lesson in Altana, but Altana has created these product passports that give every product, every physical good that can be traded cross-border, a verifiable identity and a traceable value chain. And it's continuously monitored using artificial intelligence. So instead of just reacting at the border if you get a question, if you're a trade person, you know what a CF-28 is, if you get a detention on your shipment, or if you're otherwise prohibited from importing something or exporting something, it's too late to solve the problem at that point. So a passport gives you that freedom to get ahead of the issue. And nowhere is that more critical than in IT and electronic trade. These are dense, opaque, I think has already been used, geopolitically sensitive supply chains. So I actually managed trade compliance at Amazon and Microsoft back in the early 2010s. And I know that a single device can have minerals from half a dozen countries, chips that are fabricated from multiple locations, sub-assemblies with dual-use components. And the product passport that we've designed traces those components back to their origins, wafer to chip, chip to board, module to device, all these things, so that you can answer the questions that you're now held to account for, right? Where was the wafer produced? Which suppliers handled the sensitive IP? Which upstream suppliers introduced a forced labor risk or a tariff exposure or some sort of national security issue? So that's the genesis of where they came from. Now, your question was, how can they help this sector, right? So these passports can unlock some predictable border clearances. Importers can illuminate their value chains. They can surface risks earlier so that they can get ahead of them, gather the right evidence to negate or validate that risk. And then those passports can be pre-communicated to a regulator. So we have a partnership. Altana has a partnership with CBP right now where we are exercising these product passports to get companies pre-validated products so that when their goods hit the border, they aren't detained. You can resolve all the issues associated upstream. And if it's a high risk, like again in my past, if it was a high risk tinted product that was I couldn't afford that for it to sit at the border or not move, this would be a great option for that, and it's actually working. There are other really interesting use cases besides that. There are things you can do within your companies to understand your value chains, to communicate your value chains to other parts of the business, to communicate your landed costings, to do all of these really exciting things, because it's that product-centric backbone is what we need now to navigate that we are not set up to see or use. So I can go all day talking about that, but I don't think you want me to.
Don't make any assumptions. I'm a data person myself, so I know we're coming up on time, but I thought, you provide some excellent examples on possibilities. I've spent a career thinking about data limitations and what that creates as far as limitations on policy possibilities. But I want to close perhaps with Emily on when you look at any supply chain mapping software, be it Altana or any other service. And as we look to the sorts of resolutions that were made by the administration in 2025, what we want to do going forward, what sort of policy flexibility or thoughts or possibilities does AI itself open up to advancing U.S. interests?
Well, I think in the supply chain domain itself, AI can be very useful. I think for governments in particular, it's very helpful to have human intelligence capabilities to actually map out geopolitical risk itself. Geopolitical risk, as this unit at the Commerce Department is looking at, is an in my opinion, leveraged source of a lot of trade tensions that we see today. For anyone that's been following the Nexperia case out of the Netherlands, it's had tremendous downstream impacts, not only in Europe, but Honda had to close one of its production facilities in Mexico, for example. That was essentially a failure of a government to take into account a likely retaliatory scenario that should have been obvious to play out. And so for companies, countries who are engaged in export, especially in a domain that is very closely interlinked with national security, I think we do need to think about possible retaliation. And this is why something that I anticipate seeing a lot of in the RFI public comments is calls for increased sovereignty. It sounds like a lot of American tech companies are very attuned to the wishes and desires of foreign end users of American products, and that really double-clicking on this idea of we're a certain partner, we're here to support you, we do have wiggle room, and we're able to make additional assurances to ensure that countries want to continue to buy our products. I think that's really the next chapter.
Agreed on humanity complementing AI capabilities. So in closing, Matt, anything to add?
Well, I think I would just add, I don't have a whole lot to add to that, but I think it does underscore the fact that AI is, as a general purpose technology, is increasingly an input into so many of what we might once have thought of as like legacy industry, legacy goods, legacy services that aren't sort of affected by technology. It's transforming all these at an increasingly fast rate. It bears out survey data that our association just released, showing that AI appears, just Gen AI products for consumers alone, appears to have been the fastest adopted general purpose technology, in more than the last century, like faster than automobiles, faster than the internet, faster than mobile phones. And so I think we can expect the rate of transformation to increase. And that has amazing implications for our economy, but also critical implications for trade policy as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I hope we warmed you all up this morning. So I hope you'll join me in thanking our panelists. And with that, back over to Ken.
Thank you very much to our panel. Really appreciate it. I am sure this is a topic we will be addressing at our next Trade and Tech Forum next year and then the years to come. Thank you all very much. I'd like to ask our next panel to please go to the back to get mic'd up. If you guys can hand off your mics for the next panel, we'll collect those, and we'll be getting restarted as quickly as we can get everybody back on stage. I do, I'll just do type names and titles. They have a bio with everything. Well, the bio's in their program, so you don't, if you'd like to, you can, but you don't need to if it kind of fits your flow. I'll just do names and titles, their bios and things, you can do that. I will, and you can see me, I'll give you a 5 minute, I'll stand up in 5 minutes.
Okay, yeah, we don't have one.
No. Thank you for doing this again. I've become a pro in my conference.
It is a pleasure doing it. And President tweeted about AI today.
He did.
NEO regulating states' ability
Oh,
to
yeah.
regulate AI. So lots of topical.
Good. All right, when
So
you go, yeah.
Just zip up.
Thank you. What's up? Kicking around doing the same stuff. Good luck. Claude, I'll come and say hi in a minute. If folks can please take their seats, we'd like to get started. Thank you all very much for being with us today. Thanks to our panel. We've got a great set of experts, here. We've been talking about Dickens this morning. Tale of Two Cities has come up a lot. Excuse me, can I have everybody's attention, please? Thank you. We've talked about A Christmas Carol and the Ghost of Christmas Past. I'm wondering who's going to be Scrooge now on this last panel. We're here to talk about trade, tech, and security nexus. Have a terrific panel. Welcome my old friend Rob Atkinson, the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Jeff Gertz, a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security. Dr. Alina Polyakova, president and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis. And our moderator, the Honorable Nazak Nick-Akhtar, partner in the National Security Chair at Wiley Ryan LLP. Thank you for joining us today. Nazak?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I really appreciate the distinguished panel being here and WITA for setting up this event. As we were getting mic'd up, we were sort of appreciating this notion of how the world is in a neck-and-neck race on AI and all the technology that unleashes, and our struggle to figure out what our trade and national security policies would look like. And an observation, at least, I made was America and Europe, we had been in the leadership position for decades. And so we had the luxury of over-regulating ourselves because China was so far behind. But China had been running fast all along, and now that we're neck and neck, we're looking at this sort of back at ourselves and this culture that we've become used to of regulating and sort of the expectation of regulation. And now what do we do? Because the fact that the Chinese governance system runs much faster, which leads to the next point. President Trump had a tweet or X, whatever we want to call it this morning, really announcing an executive order that's going to come out this week on potentially, right, as the president alluded to it, stepping into regulating states' ability to regulate AI, which leads to the first question. And I want to pose it to all the panelists. The world's racing for AI supremacy. It's a technology that without question is going to reshape the global economy, each country's economy, the way we learn, the way we work, the way we interact with each other, the way countries interact with each other, and our national security postures vis-a-vis one another. Yet with AI and emerging digital sovereignty priorities, the challenges in balancing innovation and regulation, bias and cultural context, accountability and transparency, and supply chain issues, energy issues. How should America and its allies position themselves to win, whether individually, whether we're going to position ourselves collectively, or both? Maybe Dr. Polyakova, maybe we could start with you.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be with my colleagues here on the panel. That's a really big question to start with, but I appreciate the opportunity to scene set. I just want to pick up on something you started with, which is this idea that we've been on top for so long that we felt like we could regulate and regulate, and it wouldn't really hurt us from an innovation perspective. I would parse that out a little bit to say that's certainly been the view in Europe and much less in the United States. And a lot of the work that we've been doing in my institution, the Center for European Policy Analysis, has been to highlight the fact that if Europe continued on this overzealous regulatory agenda, it was going to inhibit its ability to innovate in any of the tech sectors that are driving the global economy. And unfortunately, that's where Europe finds itself today. So in this global tech race for innovation, for biotech, for quantum, name any technological capability that's out there, Europe's role in that is really under question. And I think there's a lot of interesting developments we'll get into later in the panel about how Europe is now trying to kind of put the brakes on its regulatory agenda. I think it's too little too late. Because if we look at how the race for AI, which you prefaced the conversation with, is shaping up, it's very clear what it is. It's US global leadership that we must maintain and must surpass the competition with China. And Europe is nowhere to be found. It's nowhere to be found on frontier model development. It's nowhere to be found on scale-ups, right? And so there's this big question as to what the world is going to look like and where different countries are going to find themselves. From my perspective, and again, we can get into the international element of it, what's been happening is also a welcome shift, but it's a very slow shift away from risk and towards security, which is the topic of this panel. And the trick in that is, of course, that often questions about security de facto become questions about risk. But I think this is a welcome change, right? That no longer are we talking about what are the risks of AI and other related tech, but what are the security challenges we need to be thinking about on a global scale, and how do we mitigate, I guess, some of those really high risk questions. And then the regulatory piece, the second point I would make there, is that I think the entire idea of how we think about regulation through a national security lens must shift immediately. There's no omnibus that is going to regulate AI, right? Europe passed an AI Act and it's a complete disaster, and now they're trying to roll it back. Because AI has so many applications across every single sector of our economy, of our life, defense and military capabilities, that there's really no way to have an omnibus. And in fact, we have regulation already in place for financial sector, for data and healthcare, a whole variety of different regulatory compliance measures that we've implemented, that AI will just simply have to, that regulation had to simply be adapted for AI. But I think we have been thinking about it all the wrong ways. And I think, to my mind, when we think about governance, the idea that states and governments are going to be able to regulate this technology, a technology that we don't fully yet understand or fully know what its capabilities and opportunities will be, is completely misguided. And in fact, I think governance will come through the technology itself. And we can talk about what that means, but this is, I think, the next frontier of how we think about things like assurance and risk management, which we have to think about, and how we think about security. But the entire governance vector is no longer top-down. It's not governments telling companies, here's what you're going to do, and here are the laws, and go comply. Europe has done that. It's landed them in a very bad place. So I think now the innovation is happening bottom-up. The innovation is coming from the private sector, and I think it'd be much smarter to think about how in the companies and the engineers who are writing the frontier models, the LLMs, right, how we can think about integrating democratic values and principles around freedom and liberty into the baseline and the foundations of those models, which is a very different approach than what I think any policymaker has been used to over the years. And it presents a huge opportunity, to my mind, but very, very uncomfortable.
You've been advocating, and we want to come back to that because Europe is at a pivotal point, and you've been advocating some good measures that Europe has to take. So we're going to come back and unpack those. But Dr. Atkinson, over to you. I mean, we've got major issues with innovation, balancing innovation and regulation, especially while globally we have these AI data sovereignty issues domestically. The president is going to now try to regulate the states in AI. What are we doing? Where are we going to go here?
Yeah, so I can't resist bringing a Dickens reference again. I read a book 3 weeks ago, clearly the best book I've read in multiple years. It's by Martin Weiner, and it's called Culture and the Decline of British Industrialization, something like that. And it was an examination of why Britain started in leading the Industrial Revolution and why it basically became a failed state when it comes to industry. It's a shell of itself. And Weiner's thesis is a very simple one, which was that the British elite class turned against industrialization. And Dickens, by the way, was one of his cases, how Dickens was really anti-industrial. But it was beyond artists. As politicians, it was the elite class. And I think we're in a very similar place in the U.S. today. I think that's our biggest risk. I think the elite class has turned against digitalization. They've turned against AI. 95% of the articles you read on AI today are negative. Yeah. I just saw some guy who was just on George Stephanopoulos. I saw it on some feed, and he wrote some crazy book about how AI is going to completely destroy us. It's like, oh yeah, let's take that stuff seriously. So the Chinese don't have that problem. They do not have that problem. There's no sort of, oh, we're worried about AI, we're worried about digitalization. Chinese culture is, let's put the pedal to the metal and drive it through the floor. Whereas in the US, we're much more, oh, we've got to do it. Go to the president's point. Look, this is essentially a failure of Congress. Congress passed the least number of bills last year as a percentage of any Congress in history. Congress is unwilling and unable to pass a very simple law, which is to preempt the states from doing this nonsense. It's just super simple. And they won't do it, and they can't do it. And we all know that. And so I'm sympathetic to President Trump because you can argue whether he has the legal authority. I get all that, but that's not my issue. From a policy perspective, he's doing the exact right thing because the states are going to screw this up. The states are going to turn us into Europe. California is going to take the lead. So anyway, going back to what that means for trade policy, what that means for trade policy, I think, is that the digital system is under attack in many, many places around the world. And unless the West, if you will, the democratic nations who value freedom, really begin to turn the ship, turn the tide and say, wait a minute, the fight over digital with AI at the top, but not only that, that's going to be determinative of a large share of our future. If we let China win that fight, we're in deep, deep trouble. And turning against AI the way most of the elite class in Washington now has done is just, it's going to just hand it to them. So I'm more worried than I was before I read that book.
Dr. Arkin, let me ask you a follow-up question before we turn to Dr. Gertz, which is, when the internet, for some of us who are old enough to remember, when the internet was coming out, there was this huge embrace of it and how it was going to transform the world and it was going to transform everything. And then, now, obviously, with our experience with internet, there's lots of great things about it, but then there's, privacy issues and things like that. It seems like it's flipped, right? It seems like that embrace of new technology, as you're pointing out, has flipped, and everybody is very, very suspicious about it. And that's sort of led Congress to sort of abdicate its responsibility to regulate. Do you see parallels between that in terms of how we've shifted our posture towards technology when, in contrast with the advent of the internet, it was just overwhelming support?
So I actually think that I'm writing a piece, a blog on this, sort of two-part blog on the role of culture and industrial progress or digital progress. And I think the core turning point, I use it as the death of Steve Jobs in 2011. Pre-Steve Jobs, everybody was like, "Oh, this is the coolest thing ever." Post-Steve Jobs, this is like the mark of the beast. And I don't think it's because I think all this stuff people worry about privacy. Anybody in here had their privacy violated on the internet? In a serious way that affected you? I have not. I've been using the internet since I had to do the stupid dial thing. I've never had a problem. Anybody here had an experience where you had more bias from using digital platforms and AI than when you dealt with some clown getting a loan? So I just fundamentally reject the notion. I just don't think it's real. I think what's happened is it's now become, I'm old enough, and Daniel Castro at ITF, we're old enough to remember when we were the cool kids. I mean, everybody wanted to talk to us at the party because we were like the digital think tank. And now we're not the cool kids anymore. The cool kids are the kids who are like, hey, I heard about this AI thing and amazing amount of energy. It's going to destroy the planet. Or, you know how many jobs AI is going to kill? Oh, yeah, by the way, an interesting little study that MIT did. Guess how many jobs AI destroyed last year? 0.1% of all job losses. But no, we all know AI is going to kill. So I really think it's sort of gone way beyond where reality is. I mean, sure, reality has created some challenges. But imagine if we had the car. Imagine in 1930, we turned against the car because it led to suburbanization, it led to death, it led to pollution. Yeah, sure it does. And name me a technology in world history that has not had negative impacts along with the positive. You can't find any. I mean, fire, man, why did we do that? Stupidest thing in the world to invent fire, because we have fires.
Yeah. Dr. Gertz, well, AI is here to stay, whether Congress, whether the regulators like it or not. So how are you envisioning the U.S., the world, our allies, trying to balance innovation and regulation, and maybe can we?
Yeah, great. Well, thanks, Nazak, for having me, to Ken and WITA as well. So I guess my starting point for this sort of trade technology security discussion is that these three pillars have really come together in a way that they haven't before, that we kind of need to understand trade technology and security holistically like we never did before. And I think, it used to be the case that you'd have the sort of export control nerds sitting in their own little corner and the sort of trade nerds in their own little corner. And mainly the sort of national security interventions on trade and investment flows are relatively small and could be kind of excused away by the other kind of trade policy folks. That's not the case anymore. I think, particularly we're talking about AI issues and semiconductors, is very obvious that the key dual-use technologies that we see as being the future of economic prosperity are also at the center of our national security concerns and our geopolitical competition. And so I think kind of, this conflation has probably been coming for some time, but certainly over this year, particularly in the context of the US-China negotiations, we've seen that sort of the trade policy discussion, the export control discussion have really become the same discussion. And that's going to be challenging sort of both for national security people that need to understand trade policy, but also for all the trade people that are kind of really need to get smart on export controls, investment screening, all these issues, because this is all kind of one world now. So, I think kind of for the United States, it poses a few challenges. One, I think, we really need much more clarity on sort of what is our China strategy going forward. I think, where we sit today is sort of pretty clear, in my view, from the administration that they're kind of very cautious about taking any new competitive actions in the national security space against China for the view that this may sort of upset the trade truce. Again, I think there's some logic to that in terms of, I think we sort of saw the threats of the rare earths export controls and kind of the administration, needed to act against that. But we're a little bit unclear now sort of where we are going. I think the administration at times has been much more sort of aggressive towards China, at times much more accommodationist, and I think we need real kind of clarity on what the vision is there. The second thing we really need, though, to sort of come back to some of this regulation and innovation discussion is sort of a much more robust domestic agenda on where are we making the big investments, the regulatory changes, to both ensure that we are kind of pushing forward our own innovation frontier and kind of maintaining our lead where we have it, catching up where we don't, and I'd add kind of really most urgently addressing the vulnerabilities that we have, our dependencies on China on some of these issues. Again, I'd say the kind of rare earth controls being at the top of that list, but doing some kind of like broader sort of holistic assessment of where are our dependencies on China and how can we kind of carry forward that de-risking agenda, given that at the moment is sort of really kind of holding back us from taking other actions relative to China. The third thing I'd say this kind of goes to, again, how does the government kind of carry out this work? We're going to need to have much more integration between the kind of trade policy folks and the economic security folks. And we're going to kind of need to bring that toolkit together. On my colleague Emily Kilcrease, we've been sort of pushing the administration to have an economic security strategy that I think kind of lays out the entire toolkit here and sort of thinks about, how do all these different pieces work together? How are we ensuring that kind of USTR, Commerce, kind of Treasury, State, all the different agencies are kind of speaking to each other and kind of on the same page on some of these economic security issues. I think there's a lot of work to be done there. And then maybe further, as Corey was saying, there's still going to be a huge agenda. How do we bring our allies and partners along with us? Again, I think this is sort of remains one of the key advantages the U.S. has in its competition with China, is that there are a lot of countries around the world that sort of, despite everything, would still much rather work with the United States than with China on this agenda. But they have real questions. They have real questions on what is the U.S.-China policy. I speak to lots of foreign governments, and I hear, frankly, lots of governments, our sort of traditional allies, have come a long way in the last sort of 5 to 10 years saying, we agree on the de-risking from China. We're sort of ready to act with the United States here. But they are very, frankly, reasonably kind of nervous that they are going to take actions to de-risk from China, only to see the United States then come in kind of beneath them and sort of undercut them and say, actually, we're welcoming Chinese investment now. So I think, getting the China strategy right and bringing the allies along with us are going to have to go together, but that's sort of top of the agenda for me.
Yeah, let me pull on that a little bit more, Dr. Gertz, and I'll stick with you. I think one takeaway from all the panelists' discussion is that we've known about AI for a while now. AI has been just developing so quickly, but yet we still do not have a national strategy on AI and how we're going to think about AI and where we're going to embrace AI and where we need to regulate AI. And it really is then, to Dr. Atkinson's point, a really failure of policymakers across the board to actually spend a minute and think about this. And maybe they've defaulted to the sort of criticize aspects, whether the energy, whatever, because it's an easier concept to grasp than to think about this sort of beast in a way that's being unleashed, a good beast potentially, that's being unleashed, but nobody knows how to think about it. But Dr. Gertz, I want to stick with you sort of about this China thing. You've written about the need for economic security agreements with allies to strengthen our alignment, open markets, guard against adversarial interests. President administration, the question is, how is this going to square away with the Trump administration's new national security strategy, which, as you mentioned, treats China as an ally and emphasizes, quote, the primacy of nations, and then takes aim at international organizations, quote, sovereign sapping incursions of intrusive transnational organizations. This prompted the Polish leader, Prime Minister Donald Tusk, to post on social media, "Dear American friends, Europe is your closest ally, not your problem. And we have common enemies. At least that's how it has been in the last 80 years. We need to stick to this. This is the only reasonable strategy of our common security, unless something has changed." Then we've got President Macron, who recently went to China to try to sort of resolve some stuff, comes back and threatens China with tariffs for unfair trade practices. What does it take? What does it take for us to be clear-eyed on at least where we need to go? We may not need to have all the answers to all the tricky trade and national security problems with that technology may pose or opportunities that unleashes. But what does it take for us to get on the same page, America and our allies?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, it's a great question. I think, look, I'd start with the point that we need to hear more from this administration on sort of what is their long-term vision for the sort of sustainable economic and national security relationship with China. And I think, there was hints of that in the national security strategy, but frankly, I read it and it was sort of a bit unclear on ultimately where do they want to go. And again, we're in this sort of short-term moment where we're sort of afraid of destabilizing the trade truce we have at the moment. I frankly don't think the kind of current trade truce is going to last kind of indefinitely. It's going to sort of destabilize in some way. I think kind of US and China just have fundamentally misaligned interests on these issues, and these kind of things are going to keep coming up. But I think we need to hear longer, sort of by administration, sort of de-risking, not decoupling. I'm not sort of wedded to that language particularly, but we need sort of some type of vision in terms of like where we want to go. I mean, I will say on allies, my own view is that kind of allies' positions on this have changed a fair bit, that they are kind of waking up to the China challenge in a way that sort of 5 or 10 years they were not paying attention to it, kind of most of all in Europe. I think this is true. I think, partially as we have seen the US kind of put up more trade defenses relative to China. We are seeing this kind of China shock 2.0 of exports that are flooding the rest of the world. As Chinese exports are kind of not coming to the United States, they're going to every other market around the world, and we're seeing real tensions in other markets that are being flooded by cheap Chinese imports. So I think you're kind of going to see more countries sort of, for their own interests, kind of taking positions similar to the United States. Again, I think the question will be, can the U.S. and its allies kind of coordinate our positions in a way that makes sense? And again, along with my colleague Emily Kilcrease, we've written about this idea of economic and security agreements, which is how you essentially build in deeper integration among like-minded allies alongside kind of common barriers, common kind of protections against kind of the threat primarily from China and other adversaries as well. I will say I think there's some real interest in the administration in carrying this forward. I'm going to be watching very closely the USMCA review, where I think there's talk about kind of bringing economic security tools into the USMCA review. Can we get sort of Mexico to stand up its investment screening programs, kind of more common tariffs through the USMCA process? So that's something I'll be watching on this. But again, a lot of it is going to come back to, can we get clarity from the administration on what's the vision for the China relationship?
That leads to more questions in terms of sort of at least what our, Dr. Polyakova, what our allies need to do. Where is Europe on competition with the United States and China? You've called for Europe to innovate rather than regulate more, beyond GDPR, beyond the Digital Services Act to combat illegal content, the AI Act, the Digital Markets Act, which is imposing prohibitions on large tech companies, designated as, quote, gatekeepers, Google, Apple, Meta. You've called for Europe to drop digital sovereignty and embrace digital solidarity. Could Europe do this? And could it embrace actually working with the US rather than working with China? And how should the Europeans approach such an endeavor? And does this create opportunities to work with American companies and the American government, given Europe's posture that has been in tech pretty anti-American companies?
So I will do some shameless self-promotion and say that we wrote a paper on this. It's called Tech 2030. It's available online if you go to our website, CEPA.org, which outlines very pragmatic opportunities for where, despite Europe's really lagging behind in tech innovation, there's still very pragmatic opportunities for Europe-US cooperation. Because I think there's a much bigger picture. What I find really interesting about the conversation so far is that in the national security strategy that came out last week, there was a lot of emotional responses. You mentioned one of them from the Polish Prime Minister, but many, many others, to the formulation around the US relationship with Europe in particular. And I took the weekend to read a lot of commentary, but also read the NSS Europe section and the tech sections a few times. And there's a couple of observations there. One, I find it interesting that even though the NSS clearly says that Europe is in third place in terms of global priorities, it's the Western Hemisphere, Indo-Pacific, then Europe. All we're talking about on this panel is US cooperation with allies, and by allies we seem to be meaning our closest allies in Europe, despite all the problems. And I think there's a very clear reason for this. It is the biggest trade relationship in the world. It's 1.3 trillion in trade. I was checking the numbers before I got here. I think it was from last year. That was still 40% bigger than the US-China trade relationship. So we often talk about the inherent links between the United States and China, and we forget what the actual behemoth is in the global economy. And the opportunity there is so huge. For that transatlantic alliance on tech and trade and security provides so much strategic depth that China on its own doesn't have. China cannot speak to similar alliances at that level at all. So I think we need to use this and deploy this in a thoughtful way. I think most of the responsibility is on Europe, however. If you take a look at this report, it's really a strategic roadmap. And most of the focus is what can the Europeans do, but not just what can they, what must they do? I think the reality is that the NSS took people by surprise. It shouldn't have. To my mind, there's nothing that's surprising in that document that the administration hasn't said before. But I think having it written in black and white was something else for a lot of Europeans. But you can read it in a lot of different ways. The way I read it is that it really comes out on the side of clearly saying that the Europe is our strategic partner and ally, and then the US wants a strong, not a weak Europe. I think this is so important. And we really underestimate that this is now the administration's very, very clear and explicit view. So I think Europeans for a long time have failed to see the opportunity in closer collaboration with the United States on technology because they focus so much on regulation. And right, I said earlier, the ship on AI innovation, the ship on scale has sailed. But there's still areas where Europe has some, I wouldn't say comparative advantage, but definitely opportunities. And I think quantum is one area. Having some sort of pact on the semiconductor export control side, there's an opportunity there. This admin has reversed a lot of previous administration's policies in export controls. There's more we can do together there. Europe has come a long way in China, but I keep just going back to the points, like stop asking what the US is doing, just act in your own interest. And it's clearly not in the European interest to have their infrastructure run by Huawei, that doesn't care about security at all, doesn't care about privacy at all. That's already been happening. To have other Chinese companies, being the main marketplace where people buy goods and services, to be the main providers of the internet and the telco infrastructure writ large. There's clearly no interest from a security side in China dominating the European market. So to my mind, it's not really a question of choice. There is only one choice, and that only choice is US. And that's not going to be in everything, but it's going to be in a majority of kind of foundational capabilities that Europeans can then build on top of and reap the rewards. And so I think there's real pragmatic places where we can cooperate, but there needs to be a vision in place for how we are going to work together to build a global digital infrastructure, right? Not a Chinese infrastructure, which is already happening, but one that is led by the United States and our allies, because again, that is where governance will come from, right? It's not going to come from policymakers in Washington having a European-style AI Act. That's just not going to happen. So to my mind, I read the NSS very, very differently than how it could be read if you cherry pick some of the other comments that we've been talking about. Last thing I'll say, and then I'll stop, is that I think there is an AI strategy from this admin. The AI action plan outlines very clearly what we want from technology, right, in the United States, how we want to use technology, and we want the role of technology to be in our own economic and national security. I think in the NSS, I read all the sections about tech, which were more vague than I would have liked, frankly, but it clearly says that our vision is to deploy the global US AI stack. That is a strategy and a vision. So we've been very clear about it, so I'm not sure why we still are confused about what the US vision is. The details are ambiguous, I admit, but the vision is very clear.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. I mean, what drives me crazy from policy announcements by the executive branch constantly, it's these grandiose proclamations of we're going to do this and nothing really implementable. But Dr. Adkison, this is a really important point. We need to grow. The US government pulled down the AI diffusion rule. It's all about promoting US tech leadership, working with our allies. But then we've got, as you call it, the non-tariff attacks on businesses. And the Europeans, when we talk in the US, we put so much primacy on relationships and working with allies, and the tone in Europe tends to be very different, at least in my experience, potentially yours, where it's the Americans are growing too much. We got to do something to deal with the Americans and limit Americans' growth. How are we going to grow collectively together if the United States is constantly dealing with these non-tariff attacks by the Europeans, and can we overcome it? What are the prospects of working with Europe under these circumstances?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we coined this term non-tariff attacks because everybody's talking about barriers, but when the EU is raking in tens of billions of dollars by fining U.S. companies, that's not a barrier, that's an attack. And so we need a new sort of terminology, state-of-art terminology for them. Look, I think the real problem is what are we actually trying to do? So pre-91, it was pretty clear what we were trying to do. We were trying to integrate most of the world except for the second world. Nobody was talking about having a free trade agreement with Bulgaria. Okay, those guys were over there, they were commies, they were behind this whole Iron Curtain, and we were doing that. And then all of a sudden that fell, and we're like, you know, the what is it, the dog that caught the, whatever that phrase is, you know, it's like we didn't know what to do. And you had people like Fukuyama in the end of history say, you know, we're here, it's a utopian world, which the Europeans still believe, by the way. I mean, they bought the Fukuyama Kool-Aid, drank the Kool-Aid that it's the end of history. It was clearly he was wrong, fundamentally wrong. It's not the end of history, it was the rise of China. The Chinese looked at the Leninist Marxist failure in Russia and they said, we're not going to make that mistake. We're going to do it in a different way. And so what we went from was this sort of global free trade utopian ideology, which then there was a backlash against, which you could call Trumpianism, the backlash, sort of the Jacobian backlash against the French monarchy. And now, you know, as much as the Trump administration talks about doing these other things, look, at the end of the day, there's a lot of people in the Trump administration who look at the world as we're big enough as an economy, we don't need the rest of the world. And we heard it this morning, we just need more manufacturing here. Really? Baseball gloves? Baseball bats? There's a lot of things we don't want to make here. We should never make here. And so that leads into this question of what should and by the way, the other core component of U.S. trade policy was, it's like the Trump administration thinks everything's equal. Baseball gloves are the same as semiconductors. It's all manufacturing. The free traders said the same thing. There was no prioritization. Yeah, we want to have open markets for our soybean producers, and we also want to have them for our cars. So there's no differentiation. And I think we're in a new world, and the new world essentially has to be that the U.S. takes the lead on creating strategic trade partnerships. Actually, I would call them beyond trade partnerships, strategic partnerships. And what those partnerships essentially are you join with us to keep China from taking over what we have termed national power industries. So there's a whole set of industries that don't matter. They just don't matter. If the Chinese were to dominate, the industries the Chinese has our biggest dependency, if they really wanted to cut us off, and this would be the time to do it, it's Christmas tinsel. They dominate the tinsel industry, and they could screw us overnight. They could cut off all of our tinsel, and we wouldn't care, right? But they also increasingly dominate a lot of other sectors. And the goal for them is to dominate these power industries, aerospace. 20 years from now, aerospace industry is going to look fundamentally different than it is today. Machine tools, chemicals. They already account for most of the world's bulk chemical production. And they're going to try it in AI and other IT. So the point is, how are we going to stop them? You can't stop them without a joint, unified effort that closes our markets to some of their exports, that works jointly on intelligence sharing, that works jointly on export controls, that works jointly on technology collaboration, whether it's in quantum or shipbuilding with the Koreans. But that partnership has to be contingent on two things. Countries willing to stand up and say, we're picking sides. I mean, one of the things that I really objected to in the Biden administration was they said, we're not going to force countries to pick sides. No. You have to force countries to pick sides. You're either with us or you're with them. And so I think that to me is the future. And that goes to your answer is how do you get countries now to do that? The only way to do that is to say, if you are with us in a strategic power industry partnership, you get complete access to our market, zero tariffs, no barriers, et cetera. We expect the same from you, and then we expect these other things. And the place I'm going to go to first is Tokyo, because the Japanese are going to sign on to that agreement right away. They're ready to go. The Europeans will be close to last in line. I think the Europeans should be first in line, because I think they're more important than Japan, but I don't see the Europeans having the courage, the integrity, or the political will to do this. I mean, when Macron is still going to Beijing, begging them to invest, and taking advantage of our pushing back against China so they can go in and get market access to take advantage of what the U.S. has done to ensure global leadership and global freedom. And then the Europeans go in there. How many Boeing planes have been sold in China in the last 6 years? Almost none. Why is that? Because Airbus has gone in there and taken advantage of that. If the Europeans had any integrity, they would have said, you know what, we're not going to sell them any Airbuses until you stop doing this stuff. But they didn't. They took advantage of us. So that's my rant. I just don't see the Europeans willing to do this. I think we're going to have to go to other countries like the Australians, like the Brits, like the Japanese, ideally the Koreans, and then we can go from there.
And one final point in our agreements too that you mentioned is wafer fabrication, AI wafer fabrication. We need to collectively work together on solving that. It looks like we're out of time. Please join me in thanking our panelists for their insights.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jeff, Alina, Rob, and Nazak. Greatly appreciate you making the time. Not going to say who the Scrooge was on the stage. My old friend, thank you for joining us. And we have one more session left, everybody. You guys can come on down. We're going to be joined in just a moment by Congresswoman Suzanne DelBene, Congressman Darren LaHood, and Josh Calmer. And if they can come on, if Josh can come on up, our members of Congress will be joining us on Zoom in a session moderated by Josh Calmer, the Chief Global Affairs Officer of Zoom Communications. We'll be talking about that. Exactly. Sorry? Yeah. Our WITA is based here. I myself. Yeah, but anytime. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Okay. Here is, okay. Darren LaHood. You ready to roll, Josh? If folks can please take their seats. I'd like to welcome our friends on camera. Hopefully our technology will work, Josh. Here we go. Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. We've had a very full day. Welcome to Congressman Darren LaHood and Congresswoman Suzanne DelBene. Both are the leaders of the Digital Trade Caucus, and both are members of the House Ways and Means Committee and winners of WITA's Congressional Leadership Award in the past. We are thrilled to have you join us. We had hoped to have this conference on a day when Congress was in session, but Congress is not in session today, but they are so kind to make the time to join us both here at the conference. We are thrilled also to have you here on Zoom technology, which is WITA's preferred platform, and we're thrilled to be joined as well by our moderator, Josh Calmer, the Chief Global Affairs Officer at Zoom Communications. To the Congressman and Congresswoman, the theme today has seemed to have taken on a Dickensian theme. We've talked about Great Expectations, The Ghost of Christmas Past and Christmas Future. Scrooge has come up a couple of times. The Bleak House a couple of times as well. But we're looking forward to your conversation and appreciate your being with us today.
I don't have anything up my sleeve Dickens related, so maybe we'll kill that here. Thank you, and I didn't pay him to say those nice words about Zoom, but we are delighted to have WITA as a Zoom customer. Thank you for having me, Ken. And I think, what we've learned this morning, and I think what WITA gets so right, is that international trade is no longer, just about tariffs and soybeans and even data flows. It's, I think Jeff put it well in the last session. This is about our competitiveness, it's about our influence, it's about our technological leadership, and it's about our national security. And we have to understand it in that context. And so in a way, it's fitting to conclude this incredible event with a discussion of the congressional role in U.S. global tech leadership, because it's in Congress that we get represented, and that we have people who are thinking through these issues in an integrated way and thinking about the trade-offs that are involved. And in a way, I can't think of two people on the planet who are better positioned to do that than Congresswoman Del Bene and Congressman LaHood. So thank you to both of you. I'm looking at the camera. You're on the screen to my left. I'm going to try to resist the temptation to move back and forth. But Congresswoman Del Bene, let's start with you. I'm actually going to ask you both the same question to get started, but we'll start with you. Just to step back a little bit, the two of you, as co-chairs of the Digital Trade Caucus, have been working together for years now in a bipartisan way on these issues of critical importance to our economic competitiveness and our national security. And you've been consistently bipartisan in an environment where it's increasingly difficult to be bipartisan. So the question is, how do you make it work? What's the secret to the success? And I think, regardless of the issue, what are some lessons that we can draw from your work together about how to work better together?
Well, thank you for the question, and just thank you so much to WITA for hosting this important discussion and for having us here. And thanks to my colleague, Congressman LaHood, for being such a great partner on the Digital Trade Caucus. We have, as you said, worked in a bipartisan way. It may seem a little more rare in Washington, D.C. these days, but these issues are critically important, and I think they are issues that we should be able to come together on. We have a shared vision that digital trade isn't its own niche policy, but that it's the future of how the global economy will operate. It's critical to how the economy operates right now in many sectors. Maybe that's one of the other things we've tried hard to talk to folks about, is this isn't just about technology. This impacts many, many different sectors across our economy. And so we have been very focused on what we can do to move the ball forward on digital trade. And to do that, we need to work in a bipartisan way. We need broad support, and we should be able to have that. It makes us more effectively able to advocate on issues, independent of who's in controlling Congress or who's in the White House. And so I think we should remember that trade has gone digital, and studies have shown that digital flows now have a larger impact on GDP growth than trade in traditional goods. So this is a critical issue, and it's great to be working alongside my partner, Congressman LaHood, but also to do our job to educate our colleagues so that we can move forward, because I think we can collectively agree that we're behind where we should be, at least from a policy perspective.
Terrific. Thank you, Congresswoman. Congressman LaHood, how about you? Secrets to the success of your relationship and work together?
Well, first of all, I want to thank WITA for putting on this Trade and Technology Summit. And Josh, good to be with you on Zoom with my co-chair, Congresswoman Del Bene, and with everybody in the audience today to have this important conversation, and appreciate the tremendous work that WITA does in terms of an advocacy role in Washington, D.C. And I would echo many of the comments from Susan on our work together on digital trade. And I would just make a couple other observations. Obviously, we serve together on the Ways and Means Committee, which has a tremendous amount of jurisdiction over trade and the regulatory environment regarding digital trade. And I would also just say that I also serve on our select committee on China, which looks at how do we win the strategic competition against China. And obviously, America's global technology leadership matters. And if we were having this conversation, say, 10 years ago, I'm not sure the digital impact would have been affected all across the country like it is now. So in a district like mine, where I represent a fairly rural area, I have a large agriculture district, but I have companies like John Deere and Caterpillar that are immensely affected by digital trade. And so the vernacular of digital trade and digital services 10 years ago may not have been on the tip of everybody's tongue, but it is now. And whether you're Republican or Democrat across the country, you're affected by the public policy issues that go on in Washington, D.C. And I would also just say, as we look at the strategic competition against China, they are a fierce adversary when it comes to digital trade. You look at the digital Silk Road that they're involved with, you look at how they're continuing to push policies around the globe, and that affects our innovation. It affects our ability to continue to succeed at levels we need to continue to do that. And so combating some of those policies and proposals that sometimes target U.S. businesses and threaten to undermine U.S. innovation shouldn't be a partisan issue. It's very much a bipartisan issue. And Susan and I have tried to continue, as she mentioned, educate members to be strong advocates and remind them that this is really an American innovation issue more than it is a partisan issue in any way.
Congressman, I'm so glad you mentioned that point. I actually had a question for you a little later in the discussion about that, but I just want to go to it now. To me, one of the most compelling things about digital trade is that such a large proportion of the benefits accrue to what are sort of called traditional industries, agriculture, manufacturing, even some services industries. And I think there's no better example of that than probably your district in your state. And you mentioned Caterpillar and John Deere. I just think that's an incredibly impactful argument. But I've been puzzled for years at how we're so bad at telling the story about it. When I say we, I think mostly us in industry, myself and my organizations included. How do we get better at that? How do we help people understand in a real way that this isn't some esoteric set of things that really only benefits tech companies, although of course tech companies do benefit from better rules, but that it's everybody that stands to benefit?
Well, I would just say on that, Josh, I think it's a work in progress, but we're clearly not there yet. And I put it back sometimes on industry to pivot a little bit. I mean, traditionally, we want to be engaged on traditional trade, but in the digital services, I mean, as we continue to see the momentum and the changes that are occurring with many of our these nations in Europe and across Asia, this is going to become much more important. And so, for instance, this fall, I got up in a combine, I think 3 or 4 different times during harvest. I don't normally get up that much, but the government shutdown caused me to be home a little bit more. And so, but what I'm amazed about is you get into these combines that are just full of technology, and you get to see the cloud services that are used, but the immense technology in there that helps our farmers be more efficient, more effective, and more accountable. And so, it's things like that, getting more members of Congress to be engaged in those type of activities, I think is important. And I think industry has to play a role in that in terms of continuing to remind folks how they're directly affected in rural areas just as much as urban areas across our nation. And so we're not there yet. We have a long ways to go, but it's going to be more important than ever that we continue to be engaged in that space.
Great. And it actually occurs to me sitting here that there's probably no better source of both data and argumentation around this issue than from my friend Rob Atkinson and ITIF. So if you haven't spent time on his organization's website looking at their reports and being informed by their analyses, I would definitely recommend it. Okay, Congresswoman Del Bene. One area where I think arcane trade language is at its zenith is on the topic of the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions, which has been terminology that has been impenetrable for years, but it basically means you can't tax data flows. And this is an issue where it's been extraordinarily difficult to achieve a lasting global consensus around. We have this pattern of every 2 years at WTO ministerials, member countries agreeing to continue the moratorium, to continue to refrain from imposing tariffs on data flows, but making it permanent, we haven't quite got there yet. The administration has sent some signals about the upcoming WTO ministerial in March and the possibility of making it permanent, which is something I understand you and probably just about everybody in this room would agree with. What's your view on that? What does success look like at the ministerial? How can we support colleagues in the U.S. government in getting there? Any other actions we should take to try to get that commitment made permanent?
Well, a great question, and definitely an area to your original question where there is a lot of bipartisan support. Congressman LaHood and I worked together before the 13th WTO ministerial to show support from Congress for extending the e-commerce moratorium, and I think it's important that we show that bipartisan support. We're regularly asked by foreign partners what issues will continue to be priorities when, if political power changes hands. Is there something that's kind of consistent across the board? And I think that's why having a bipartisan caucus like ours provide a clear signal that the moratorium will be a priority, regardless of who's in the White House or who controls the gavels in Congress, is important. If the moratorium is not renewed, governments around the world would be free to impose tariffs and other trade barriers on a variety of American industries that transmit products and services electronically and rely heavily on the free flow of data around the globe. And many industries do that, as we were talking about manufacturing, agriculture, entertainment, software, semiconductors, aerospace, financial services, autos, medical devices, we go on and on. So I think it's also important that we remind folks how essential the moratorium is for small and medium-sized businesses and entrepreneurs who are using digital tools to reach new customers overseas. They don't have the resources to set up physical operations in every country in which they sell to avoid those duties that would be imposed on electronic transmissions. So if we talk about the breadth of businesses that would be impacted, I think those stories are going to be critically important to help people understand the importance of the moratorium. And also another reason why this is such a bipartisan effort because of the broad impact.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned small businesses. I should have included that part in the earlier remarks about where the benefits accrue, because on so many of these topics, it's the small businesses that this country relies on that stand to gain or lose depending on where policy comes out. Congressman LaHood, over to you. Digital services taxes is something you've been especially focused on over the years. This is an issue, by the way, that affects companies throughout the technology space, but one that actually at Zoom we felt particularly closely. We're a globally recognized brand, but we're relatively small company as globally recognized tech companies go. And so the idea of paying tax not on profits, but on the revenue of our operations in countries around the world, including many where we have no physical presence, is hard to stomach. And we're seeing a kind of an upsurge in the popularity of DSTs. We've got France considering doubling its DST to 6%, Spain thinking about going as high as 15%. The Trump administration opened Section 301 investigations on these back in its first term. Those are paused at the moment, but what do you think? Should we try to reopen those? Are there steps that Congress can take specifically? Anything else we can do on the DST front?
Well, Josh, I think you teed it up very well. And I would just say this, these DSTs, I think we've had broad bipartisan support in terms of pushing back on those. And I obviously strongly supported the Section 301 investigation during the first Trump administration when that was initiated. And as you referenced, proposals currently by the French and other countries are designed explicitly to target U.S. companies through DSTs. But I start off with the premise these are wholly unacceptable, and we must be, prepared, Josh, to use the necessary tools to combat these actions. And I think Susan and I share that, along with many of our other colleagues. And during the last administration, I think sometimes we retreated a little bit in the leadership role in protecting digital trade and innovation. And I think we have to step that back up. As you probably are well aware, Josh, we've seen some progress in the current trade negotiations in addressing DSTs with Canada, which is a positive. And, so let's use that as a positive example. And I'm confident that right now, the Trump administration, in my conversations with Jamieson Greer and others, they're very tuned in on this. And we need to continue to hold these countries accountable and let them know that there will be ramifications if they want to continue to go down this road.
Yeah. Well said, well said. Congresswoman Del Bene, now going back to you, you've got a really important perspective on all of this. You spent over 2 decades in the private sector, in the technology industry, so you understand these issues instinctively. What I like to, I don't know if the right way to put it is the big three, but the core elements of strong digital trade rules, there's mostly a consensus they have to do with generally free cross-border data flows, general prohibition on data localization measures, and a general prohibition on requirements to transfer source code. These are commitments that the United States itself has had an ambivalent relationship with over the last several years, and that are increasingly under attack, I think is a fair way to put it, certainly under review around the world. You have spoken a lot, and I really like this turn of phrase, about the importance of the United States being a rule maker rather than a rule taker. It seems to me there's no more important area for the United States to be a rule maker on than when it comes to getting the big three accepted, if not as a global standard, as a substantially proliferated standard around the world to the benefit of the U.S. economy and American workers. How do you think we proceed on that, though, in practical terms? Are there any steps the Congress can take? What would you like to see the administration do? How can industry support the work on this?
Thanks for that question, a great question. And I think, first of all, Congress, the administration, and industry need to be really clear about which regulations abroad are pursuing legitimate policy objectives we might agree with, which ones are undermining the fundamentals of policy innovation and the free flow of data. We have to speak with a unified voice on when these rules threaten pillars of digital trade. And part of this is we have to be clear about what our unified voice is. Part of that is domestic policy. And I've been a strong proponent of making sure we have strong domestic policy in place, because it's hard to talk about what we think international policy is going to be if we don't also have domestic policy. And one place I always start there is privacy, because if we don't have privacy rules, kind of what is our message to the international table on what privacy should be? We need federal laws because that gives us a seat at the international table. And as part of the being rule makers, we need to make those rules not only in terms of domestic policy, but we need to also be at the table internationally. I don't have to tell anybody in this room how much our lives rely on the free flow of data between countries. These aren't just tech company issues, but every American who makes an online transaction, a search, or a communication cares about this. And but again, until Congress helps put in place the rules of the road and develops a framework to talk about privacy or online safety, we're behind. So we need to not just criticize policies internationally that we don't like. We need to be making sure we're setting the policies that we think are the right alternatives going forward. And until we provide that alternative and we have consensus around that, it is going to be harder and harder for us to persuade our partners abroad to go along with that approach. So rule makers domestically helps us to be rule makers internationally.
Yeah, well said, and a perfect entree into the final question. I want to be sensitive to your time, and you've been very generous so far, so we'll wrap it up with the same question for each of you, and we'll stick with you, Congresswoman Del Bene. 2 more working weeks, functionally speaking, in this year, and then everybody will have a well-deserved rest, but we'll be off to the races again in 2026. In your view, what is the single most important thing that the Congress can do to support the negotiation of strong digital trade rules, or at least support the uptake of those rules and those principles internationally? I know on the Senate side, Senators Young and Coons are, I believe, very close to introducing legislation around this. Anything happening on the House side, other kinds of activities we should be on the lookout for?
Well, I think, first of all, to really ensure that we are able to have strong trade policy and to set those rules of the road, as I was talking about, it's critical that Congress does its job and that Congress makes sure that we are clear on our authority. We cannot have trade be at the whim of an executive who is no strategy and is not helping to move policy forward. And we need enforceable rules. So Congress needs to act. I think, something that there used to be a strong bipartisan message about the important role, the constitutional role that Congress plays here. I wish we had kind of more of a strong statement there, because I think if we're going to have those long-lasting rules, and I said that survive beyond any particular person who's in the White House or who's in charge of Congress, it's critically important that Congress does its job as making sure that we are having a say on whether it's tariffs or trade policy, that long-term trade policy needs to go through Congress. That's probably the top thing I would suggest.
Fantastic, thank you. And Congressman LaHood, how about you?
Just to build on what Susan said there, I think we're all kind of watching to see what happens with the Supreme Court ruling on tariffs, a little separate from digital services, but still, I think depending on where the Supreme Court goes, and if it strikes down the current tariff predicate that the president has used, that gives us an opportunity to fill that vacuum and fill that void of Congress being engaged. And I've been pretty vocal that tariffs are taxes. They're taxes on my farmers, my constituents, my manufacturers. And that opportunity, depending on what direction it goes, I've encouraged my colleagues on the Ways and Means Committee, this is our opportunity to fill that void and take back that congressional authority that we are a co-equal branch of government, and we need to play an appropriate role when it comes to trade on that. And of course, that also applies to digital trade also. That's the first observation. Second thing that I would just say, Josh, is go back to the USMCA and negotiated in a bipartisan way during the first Trump administration. If you look at the digital trade chapter that was put together there through a lot of bipartisan work, really the gold standard in many ways in terms of future trade agreements. And I've encouraged Ambassador Greer and others to go back to that model that worked very well under Ambassador Lighthizer at the time. And of course, Jameson Greer worked for Ambassador Lighthizer. That ought to be our standard moving forward, is building off that, revising that appropriately as things change, but use that template for future bipartisan agreements.
Great. Thank you. Well, let me just wrap up by thanking both of you for your time and your thoughts, but more broadly for your partnership both with each other and with industry and the outside world over these last several years. Lots to do coming up, but we look forward to working together to do it. And I just wish you happy holidays, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask all of our folks in the audience, before you guys just turn off your Zoom, for everybody in the audience to turn around and wave back at the camera. We're all glad to have you here. Thank you for joining us. On Zoom, we hope to have you back in person. Josh, thank you for moderating. Congressman LaHood, Congresswoman Del Bene, thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you in the room, we have hot lunch. In a cold room, but a hot lunch sitting outside. It's waiting for you. Please enjoy.